I was invited to Easter dinner at my parents' sprawling estate in Connecticut. When I walked through the heavy oak doors, there was no roasted lamb, no pastel decorations, and no festive music playing. Instead, I found 13 of my relatives sitting in a tight circle in the sunken living room with one solitary, empty chair placed perfectly in the center. My mother pointed to it, her face a mask of cold disgust, and announced that they all agreed I was the toxic cancer destroying our family. I did not cry or beg for forgiveness. I simply took the seat, listened to their venom for exactly 1 hour, and then played a single audio recording from 5 years ago. Within 2 minutes, the entire room emptied out in absolute panic and police sirens were echoing down the driveway. My name is Stella. I am 33 years old, and I am the founder and chief executive officer of a premier forensic data analytics firm. My family, however, still firmly believes I am a mentally unstable, penniless failure who ruined her own life. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic relatives who severely underestimated your worth and tried to gaslight you into believing you were the problem. The air inside my parents' Connecticut mansion was always perfectly climate-controlled, but that Sunday afternoon it felt suffocatingly cold. I had driven 2 hours from my penthouse in the city, bringing a vintage bottle of Cabernet Sauvignon as a peace offering for what I assumed would be a tense but traditional holiday meal. I should have known better. The driveway was packed with luxury vehicles belonging to my aunts, uncles, and cousins. When I stepped into the grand foyer, the silence was immediate and heavy. There was no clinking of silverware from the formal dining room. There was no smell of glazed ham or fresh spring vegetables. I walked into the massive living room and stopped dead in my tracks. 13 people were seated in a large circle. My father Richard sat in his high-backed leather armchair, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, projecting the image of a disappointed patriarch. Next to him sat my mother Helen, wearing a tailored cashmere sweater and a look of absolute martyrdom. To their right was my older brother Connor, the undisputed golden child of the family. He wore a designer suit even on a Sunday, lounging in his chair, with a smug, self-satisfied smirk playing on his lips. Connor ran what everyone believed was a highly successful venture capital fund in Silicon Valley, making him the absolute pride and joy of the Evans family. The rest of the circle was filled out by extended family members. Aunt Brenda sat clutching her designer handbag, refusing to meet my eyes. Uncle Tom was shaking his head slowly, as if looking at a tragic accident. Cousins I had not spoken to in years sat with their arms crossed, unified in their judgment. Right in the dead center of this human firing squad sat one empty wooden chair. Helen broke the silence. Her voice was sharp and perfectly modulated to carry across the large room. "Sit down, Stella. We are not having dinner today. It is time this family had a formal intervention. We have all gathered here because we collectively agree that you are the cancer of the Evans family." 5 years ago, a statement like that from my own mother would have shattered me into a million pieces. 5 years ago, I would have collapsed into that wooden chair, weeping and begging for their love, desperately trying to prove that I was not the crazy, unstable disappointment they had painted me to be. I would have tried to defend myself against the lies they had spread to every person in that room. But I was no longer the broken 28-year-old girl they had driven out of this very house. I was a woman who spent her days hunting down white-collar criminals, dismantling corporate fraud, and destroying men far more powerful than anyone sitting in this circle. I knew how to read a room, and I knew how to win a war. I looked around at the 13 faces staring back at me, waiting for me to break. I looked at Connor, whose arrogant smile suggested he had orchestrated this entire spectacle to further elevate his own status as the perfect son. I looked at Richard, who was waiting to deliver his heavy-handed lectures about duty and success. I looked at Helen, who was practically vibrating with the thrill of being the center of attention, playing the tragic mother burdened with a defective child. I did not drop my gaze. I did not shed a single tear. I walked slowly to the center of the room, my heels clicking sharply against the polished hardwood floor. I set the expensive bottle of wine down on the small side table next to the empty chair. I smoothed the skirt of my dress, sat down gracefully, and crossed my legs. The utter lack of panic in my demeanor seemed to confuse them. A few cousins exchanged uncertain glances. Helen narrowed her eyes, clearly annoyed that I was not immediately dissolving into hysterics. I reached into my purse, pulled out my smartphone, and opened the clock application. I tapped the screen a few times, setting a timer for exactly 60 minutes. I turned the volume all the way up and placed the phone face up on the table next to the wine bottle. I looked directly at my mother, resting my hands comfortably in my lap, and offered her a bright, relaxed smile. "I will give you exactly 60 minutes," I said, my voice calm and conversational, ringing out clearly in the silent room. "You have 1 hour to say whatever you want to say. Start the clock." Helen blinked momentarily, thrown off her script by my complete lack of resistance. But her desire to perform for the audience quickly overrode her confusion. She sat up straighter, adopting a tone of deep manufactured sorrow. "We are doing this because we love you, Stella," she began, though her eyes remained hard and cold. "But your behavior over the past few years has been a profound embarrassment to this family. You ruined your past relationships. You disappeared and refused to communicate. You have forced us to lie to our friends, telling them you were simply going through a phase, when the reality is that you are deeply unwell. You have been living a chaotic, unstable life, and you expect us to just welcome you back with open arms, while your brother here is out making a real name for our family." Richard leaned forward, pointing a thick finger at me. "Your mother is right. We have tolerated your disrespect and your failures for long enough. You sit there with that arrogant smile, but we all know the truth. You have nothing. You are a 33-year-old woman who has achieved absolutely nothing of value, while Connor has built a financial empire. We brought you here today to force you to face reality." I leaned back in the wooden chair, maintaining my pleasant smile. The timer on my phone silently counted down from 59 minutes and 50 seconds. I was ready to let them dig their own graves, word by word, lie by lie. They had no idea that while they thought they were trapping me in an intervention, they had actually just locked themselves in a room with their own worst nightmare. The countdown had begun, and when that timer hit 0, the entire Evans family facade was going to burn to the ground. The timer on my phone flashed 59 minutes and 50 seconds. Aunt Brenda was the first to strike. She leaned forward in her chair, her fingers nervously twisting her oversized pearl necklace. Her voice was laced with that specific brand of suburban venom disguised as deep concern. "You have a lot of nerve showing your face here today, Stella," Brenda began, her eyes darting around the circle to gather approval from the others. "After what you did to this family 5 years ago, you should be ashamed. You humiliated us all. You threw away a perfectly good engagement to a wonderful man, and for what? Because you completely lost your mind. Running away in the middle of the night like a frightened animal, leaving us all to clean up your mess and answer questions we had no answers for. We all know you had a total mental breakdown." Before I could even process her hypocrisy, Uncle Tom jumped in, eager to prove his absolute loyalty to my parents. He pointed an accusatory finger at me, his face already turning a splotchy shade of angry red. "Your parents had to cover for your insanity!" Stella Tom bellowed, leaning so far forward he nearly fell out of his seat. "Do you have any idea how difficult it was for Richard and Helen? They had to tell the entire neighborhood, the entire country club, that you were suffering from severe paranoid delusions. They tried to get you help and you just vanished. And look at you now." He waved his hand dismissively at my outfit. I was wearing a custom-tailored Italian suit that cost more than his entire vehicle, but to their blinded, arrogant eyes, I was just the prodigal daughter returning in rags. "Are you still living off government handouts?" Tom continued, his voice dripping with disgust. "Still scraping by on social welfare and clinging to the bottom of society, while your parents work themselves to the bone to keep the Evans name respectable? You are a parasite." I did not answer. I simply reached into my leather tote bag and pulled out a sleek silver corkscrew. The entire room fell dead silent as I deliberately peeled the foil off the vintage Cabernet Sauvignon I had brought. The sharp pop of the cork echoed loudly in the tense living room. I reached over to the side table, picked up a spare crystal glass, and poured myself a generous measure of the dark red wine. I took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the complex flavors settle on my tongue. Then I looked at the timer. 52 minutes left. My absolute silence seemed to infuriate them even more. They were hungry for a reaction. They wanted me to scream, to defend myself, to cry and beg for their understanding so they could reject me all over again. When I gave them nothing but a serene smile and a sip of wine, the floodgates opened completely. Cousins I had not spoken to since high school suddenly had deep personal grievances to air. They accused me of being inherently selfish, of desperately wanting attention, of deliberately trying to destroy family holidays with my dramatic exit 5 years ago. They parroted every single lie my parents had ever fed them, treating these fabricated stories as absolute gospel truth. For 45 minutes, I sat in the center of a hurricane of verbal abuse. They dissected my personality, my past choices, and my presumed poverty. They mocked my intelligence and sneered at my supposed mental illness. Then Helen decided it was time for the main event. She stood up from her chair, pressing a pristine white tissue to her dry eyes. It was a masterclass in theatrical manipulation. "I have endured absolute agony for half a decade," Helen cried out, her voice trembling with manufactured grief. "Do you have any idea what it is like to be a mother and have your friends constantly asking about your crazy runaway daughter?" I had to smile through the pain. I had to lie to protect your dignity. I had to pretend you were out finding yourself when we all knew you were spiraling into madness and living in the gutter. I spent nights crying myself to sleep, wondering where I went wrong with you. She paused dramatically, making sure every eye in the room was locked onto her tragic performance. Then she turned her gaze toward the golden boy. "And then I look at your brother," Helen said, her voice instantly transforming from sorrowful to fiercely proud. "Look at Connor. He is the absolute pride and joy of this family. A self-made billionaire by 35. He built a venture capital firm from the ground up. He buys us cars. He treats us to luxury vacations. He is carrying the entire Evans legacy on his shoulders, elevating our family name, while you do nothing but drag it through the mud. Why could you not just be more like him, Stella? Why did you have to be so broken and useless?" Connor adjusted the cuffs of his expensive suit. He leaned back, soaking in the adoration like a sponge. He offered the room a fake sympathetic sigh, playing the role of the benevolent, successful older brother perfectly. "It is fine, Mom," Connor said, his voice dripping with heavy condescension. "You cannot force someone to be successful. Stella just never had the drive or the intellect that I did. Some people are builders who create wealth and opportunity, and some people are just dead weight. We have to accept her limitations and hope she eventually hits rock bottom and asks for real help." I took another sip of my wine. The sheer audacity of his statement was almost poetic. Connor, the man currently running a massive financial fraud, sitting there lecturing me about wealth creation. Helen, the woman who had deliberately drugged me and stolen my future, crying about her reputation. Richard, the silent enabler, nodding along in solemn agreement. The timer on my phone flashed 10 minutes remaining. The circle of relatives began to cycle through their insults a second time, their voices growing hoarse, their arguments becoming highly repetitive. They demanded apologies. They demanded explanations for my unbothered silence. They demanded that I show some remorse for the immense pain I had supposedly caused them all. I remained entirely mute. I watched their body language. I watched the way Aunt Brenda nervously checked her phone, probably calculating how much of her retirement savings she had blindly handed over to Connor. I watched Uncle Tom puff out his chest, oblivious to the financial ruin hovering right above his head. They were all so desperately clinging to the illusion of the perfect wealthy Evans family, completely unaware that the foundation they stood on was entirely rotten. 5 minutes left. Helen was now glaring at me, her fake tears completely gone, replaced by raw, unbridled hatred. My refusal to play the victim role was driving her insane. She wanted me shattered on the floor, and instead I was treating their intervention like a mildly entertaining television show. 3 minutes, 2 minutes, 1 minute. The room finally began to run out of steam. The shouts turned into heavy, angry breathing. 13 pairs of eyes glared at me, waiting for the dramatic breakdown they had meticulously planned for. 0. The alarm on my phone chimed a soft, pleasant melody that cut through the heavy, toxic air of the living room. I reached out, tapped the screen to silence it, and set the phone face down on the table. I placed my empty wine glass next to it. I uncrossed my legs and sat up straight, meeting my father's furious gaze. The 60 minutes of relentless abuse were officially over. Now it was my turn. The silence in the living room was absolute. My father Richard stood up from his leather armchair. He smoothed the front of his expensive blazer, projecting the dominant, intimidating aura he had used to control this family for decades. He walked slowly toward the center of the circle, looming over me like a judge preparing to hand down a final sentence. He reached inside his jacket and pulled out a thick manila folder. With a swift, aggressive motion, he threw the heavy stack of legal documents onto the glass coffee table right in front of me. The sharp thud echoed against the high ceilings of the mansion. "We are done playing games," Richard said, his voice dropping into a harsh, commanding register. "We did not gather 13 people here today just to yell at a brick wall. We came here to offer you a solution, a cure for your destructive behavior. I want you to look at those papers." I did not touch the folder. I kept my hands folded neatly in my lap, maintaining my pleasant smile. "What is it, Richard?" I asked calmly. "It is a quitclaim deed," he declared, pointing a rigid finger at the documents. "You are going to sign over your entire inheritance rights to your grandmother's estate in Newport. You are going to sign it today, right now, before you leave this house." Helen immediately leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with a greedy, feverish intensity. "It is the only way, Stella. Connor has a massive opportunity. His venture capital fund is expanding globally, and he needs a rapid injection of liquid cash to secure a new international portfolio. He is going to leverage the Newport property as collateral for a commercial bridge loan. It is a brilliant financial maneuver, the kind of high-level business strategy you could never possibly comprehend." Connor adjusted his silk tie and offered me a condescending smirk. "It is purely a strategic leverage play, Stella. Silicon Valley moves fast. I need massive liquidity to close a major acquisition by Friday. The house is just sitting there doing absolutely nothing. It is dead equity. I am putting it to work to build the Evans legacy." I finally leaned forward and picked up the thick stack of papers. I did not need to read the fine print to know exactly what I was looking at. As a forensic data analyst who spent her life tracking down hidden corporate debt and financial fraud, I recognized the scent of absolute desperation from a mile away. I flipped to the second page and scanned the terms of the proposed loan they wanted to secure against my grandmother's property. The interest rate was incredibly high. The terms were predatory. No successful, thriving venture capital firm would ever resort to a high-yield, short-term commercial loan from a secondary lender, unless traditional banks had completely shut them out. Connor was not expanding. Connor was drowning. He was bleeding cash, and he needed my inheritance to plug a massive hole in a sinking ship. I kept that knowledge entirely to myself. I simply tapped the paperwork against the glass table and looked back up at my father. "And why exactly would I sign away a property that my grandmother explicitly left to me in her will?" I asked, my tone light and conversational. "Because it is your only path to redemption." Richard bellowed, his face turning red with sudden fury at my insolence. "You owe this family. You owe us for the years of shame you caused. You owe us for the embarrassment of having a runaway, unstable daughter. If you sign those papers and give your brother the capital he needs to expand his empire, we will officially forgive you. We will let you come to Thanksgiving dinner this year. We will stop telling people you are a mental patient. We will welcome you back into the fold. This is your chance to finally be useful to us." The chorus of relatives surrounding us immediately murmured their loud agreement. Aunt Brenda clapped her hands together in a show of righteous approval. "It is the most generous offer I have ever heard," she announced to the room. "Richard and Helen are giving you a golden ticket back into normal society. It is the absolute least you can do after tearing this family apart with your crazy antics 5 years ago. You should be down on your knees thanking them for the opportunity to contribute to Connor's success." Uncle Tom nodded vigorously, glaring at me with deep contempt. "If you do not sign those papers, Stella, you are proving that you are exactly as selfish, crazy, and malicious as we all said you were. You will be dead to this family forever. You will leave here today, and you will have absolutely no one. They were utilizing classic textbook psychological extortion. They genuinely believed they held all the power. They thought I was a terrified, lonely woman desperate for their conditional affection. They thought the threat of permanent exile would force me to blindly hand over a $1 million estate to fund my brother's vanity project. They framed grand larceny as a noble moral sacrifice that I was obligated to make. Helen stood up and walked over to the table. She pulled a gold-plated pen from her pocket and slammed it down on top of the quitclaim deed. "Stop being difficult for once in your miserable life," Helen snapped, dropping her fake sympathetic mother routine completely. "Pick up the pen. Sign the papers. You have caused enough damage to the Evans name. Connor is doing real work in the world. He deserves that property. You are a failure who cannot even hold down a normal relationship. You do not deserve a historic mansion in Newport. Sign the paper, Stella, and maybe we will write you a small check to help you pay your rent next month." I looked at the gold pen resting on the fraudulent documents. I looked at the 13 faces leaning in their eyes wide with greed, entitlement, and sheer arrogance. They were a pack of wolves circling a carcass, completely unaware that they were actually walking straight into a steel trap. They demanded my entire inheritance to prop up a golden child who was secretly a criminal. They demanded my absolute submission. They wanted me to buy their love by sacrificing the only tangible memory I had left of a grandmother who actually cared for me. I picked up the gold pen. Helen let out a loud, triumphant breath. Richard crossed his arms, a victorious grin spreading across his face. Connor leaned back and checked his expensive watch, clearly thinking the transaction was already complete. They thought they had won. They thought they had broken me just like they used to. I held the pen between my fingers, feeling the heavy metal. Then I slowly set it down right next to my wine glass, keeping the paperwork entirely blank. I looked directly into my father's eyes and gave him a bright, unwavering smile. "I am not signing anything, Richard. But please tell me more about this incredible business expansion. I am absolutely fascinated by how much money Connor suddenly needs." The heavy silence that followed my refusal was abruptly broken by the rhythmic tapping of leather dress shoes against the marble floor of the kitchen hallway. A figure emerged from the shadows, stepping smoothly into the bright living room. It was Bradley, my former fiancé. The man who had spectacularly broken my heart, drained our shared bank accounts, and vanished into the night with another woman exactly 5 years ago. He was wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal Armani suit. His hair was slicked back, and a heavy diamond-encrusted Rolex watch gleamed on his left wrist as he casually adjusted his cuffs. Bradley was no longer the struggling startup executive I had supported financially during our 20s. He was now the chief financial officer of Connor's highly touted venture capital firm. He had seamlessly traded my bed for my brother's boardroom, embedding himself into my family while they actively exiled me. Bradley walked over and stood right next to Helen, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. He looked at me with an expression of deep, manufactured pity. It was the exact same manipulative, gaslighting gaze he used the night I caught him cheating right before he tried to convince me I was simply having a paranoid episode. "Stella, you need to listen to reason," Bradley said, his voice dripping with that sickeningly smooth, therapeutic tone. "We are not doing this to punish you. We are doing this to protect you from yourself. I have seen the signs. We all have. Your mental illness has clearly been acting up again. You are not thinking straight. You are hoarding a $1 million property that you do not know how to manage, and you are putting yourself at serious financial risk." I stared at the gleaming Rolex on his wrist. The absolute audacity of this man standing in my parents' living room wearing a watch bought with my stolen money, trying to lecture me about financial management. "I know it is hard for you to accept," Bradley continued, stepping closer to the glass table. "But you are sick, Stella. You have been sick for a long time. When you ran away from our engagement, it was a clear manic episode. Connor and your parents are offering you a lifeline today. We want to take the heavy burden of this estate off your fragile shoulders. As the chief financial officer of Connor's fund, I can assure you the property will be professionally managed. Just sign the deed. Let us carry the weight so you can focus on getting the psychiatric help you so desperately need." Aunt Brenda nodded vigorously, wiping a fake tear from her powdered cheek. "Listen to him, Stella. Bradley has been like a second son to Richard and Helen. He stayed to support this family when you abandoned us. He knows what is best for your mental health." I did not break my smile. I simply tilted my head, looking from Bradley to Richard. "I am perfectly capable of managing my own assets," I said, keeping my voice entirely devoid of emotion. "The Newport estate remains exactly where it is, under my name." Richard slammed his fist down on the glass table, making the wine bottle rattle dangerously. The veins in his neck were bulging against his stiff collar. The facade of the concerned father vanished entirely, replaced by the ruthless, controlling tyrant I remembered so vividly from my childhood. "You leave us no choice," Richard snarled, his face inches from mine. "If you will not voluntarily sign over the property for the good of this family, we will take it from you legally. We have already spoken to our attorneys. We have drafted the initial paperwork for a full legal conservatorship." The word hung in the air like a loaded weapon. A conservatorship. The ultimate legal mechanism used to strip a human being of their basic civil rights, handing total control of their finances, health, and freedom over to a designated guardian. It was a terrifying threat, a tool often weaponized by wealthy, abusive families to trap their vulnerable relatives. "That is right," Helen chimed in, her voice shrill and victorious. "We have a private medical examiner ready to testify that you are a danger to yourself and entirely incapable of controlling your own behavior. We will present the court with your history of erratic actions, your sudden disappearance 5 years ago, and your refusal to cooperate with your loving family today. A judge will grant us full medical and financial control over your life by Friday morning." Connor leaned back in his chair, laughing softly. "It is a standard procedure for mentally incompetent adults, Stella. Dad will be appointed as your legal guardian. He will have the authority to transfer the Newport estate directly to my fund without your consent. And you? You will be placed in a secure long-term psychiatric facility where you cannot cause any more damage to the Evans name. We hold all the cards. You are completely trapped." They were dead serious. They were entirely willing to fabricate a medical diagnosis, commit perjury in a court of law, and lock their own flesh and blood in a psychiatric ward for the rest of her natural life, all to steal a house. The aunts and uncles sitting in the circle did not gasp in horror. They did not protest the blatant violation of my human rights. They simply nodded in agreement, fully complicit in the terrifying plan to destroy me for the sake of Connor's financial gain. Bradley tapped the gold pen on the table, pushing it closer to my hand. "It does not have to end in a locked hospital ward, Stella," he whispered, leaning in close so I could smell his expensive cologne. "Just sign the paper. Give Connor the collateral he needs right now. Go quietly back to whatever miserable life you have been living, and we will halt the conservatorship proceedings. We are giving you a choice, freedom or an institution." I looked at the pen. I looked at the fraudulent quitclaim deed. I looked at my parents, who were staring at me with cold, predatory anticipation. They truly believed they had cornered a helpless, mentally unstable woman. They believed their wealth and social standing in Connecticut made them completely untouchable. They thought the threat of a psychiatric lockdown would send me into a spiral of absolute terror and force my immediate submission. I picked up my crystal glass and took another slow sip of the Cabernet Sauvignon. The wine was rich, full-bodied, and tasted distinctly like victory. I set the glass down and let out a soft, genuine laugh. It started low in my chest and grew louder, ringing out across the tense, silent living room. The sound of my laughter seemed to deeply unsettle them. Richard stepped back, his eyes narrowing in confusion. Helen clutched her cashmere cardigan, looking at Bradley for reassurance. They expected tears. They expected begging. They did not expect me to laugh directly in the face of a terrifying legal threat. The raw sound of my laughter echoed against the vaulted ceiling, completely shattering the tense atmosphere they had so carefully constructed. I did not just chuckle or offer a polite, dismissive scoff. I threw my head back and let out a full, ringing laugh that bounced off the mahogany bookshelves and the expensive artwork hanging on the walls. Richard flinched violently, as if he had been physically struck across the face. Helen gripped the padded armrests of her chair, her jaw tightly clenched. her eyes darting nervously toward the extended family members. Connor scowled, clearly deeply offended that his grand, terrifying threat of locking me in a psychiatric ward was being treated as a hilarious punchline to a very bad joke. I let the laughter die down naturally, taking my time. I reached into my designer leather tote bag and entirely bypassed the cheap plastic pen Helen had thrown onto the glass table. Instead, I pulled out my own heavy custom-engraved gold pen. I brought it down against the thick glass of the coffee table. Clack. I lifted it and brought it down again. Clack. The sharp metallic sound demanded absolute silence, and the room instantly gave it to me. Every single relative held their breath, waiting to see what the supposed crazy daughter was about to do next. I locked my eyes directly onto Bradley. The smug, therapeutic expression he had worn just moments ago was beginning to melt away like cheap wax. A conservatorship, I said, repeating the word slowly, letting the heavy legal term roll off my tongue. You want to stand in a court of law and swear under oath that I am entirely incapable of managing my own assets. You, Bradley, the chief financial officer of my brother's esteemed venture capital fund, want to testify before a judge about financial responsibility and sound asset management. I leaned forward slightly, resting my elbows on my knees, never breaking eye contact with the man who had ruined my life 5 years ago. That is a truly fascinating legal strategy, I told him, keeping my voice cold and precise. Especially coming from a man who funded his current lavish lifestyle by committing felony wire fraud and grand larceny against his own fiancée. Bradley froze completely. His perfectly slicked back hair suddenly seemed to highlight the cold beads of sweat quickly forming on his forehead. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing against his tightly knotted silk tie. I do not know what you are talking about, Bradley stammered, taking a very small involuntary half-step backward. His voice entirely lacked the commanding, condescending boom he had used just a minute earlier. I am talking about the Rolex Daytona currently fastened to your left wrist, I stated, my voice ringing out clearly in the silent living room. The one you keep nervously adjusting whenever you feel cornered. The one you bought exactly 5 years and 2 months ago. Do you remember that week, Bradley? I certainly do. I turned my gaze to the extended family, ensuring every single aunt, uncle, and cousin was listening closely to the narrative I was about to dismantle. 5 years ago, while I was dealing with the immense pressure of planning our upcoming wedding, Bradley here decided he needed a little advance on his future success. He took a blank check from our joint savings account. He forged my signature with a blue ink pen. He walked into a bank branch on Fifth Avenue and wired exactly $25,000 to a private luxury jeweler in Manhattan. He drained the emergency account I had spent years building, bought himself a luxury timepiece to impress Connor so he could beg for a corporate job at the fund, and then he looked me dead in the eye and told me I must have misplaced the funds during a manic episode. He gaslit me into believing I was losing my mind, all so he could wear a stolen trophy on his wrist. Bradley turned completely ashen. The blood drained from his face so fast he looked physically ill. He instinctively reached over with his right hand and covered the face of the watch, a guilty, reflexive motion that told everyone in the room everything they needed to know. The relatives exchanged shocked, uncomfortable glances. Aunt Brenda covered her mouth with her hand. You are insane, Bradley choked out, looking desperately at Richard and Connor for backup. She is making this up. There is no proof of any of this. I earned that money. She is just a bitter, crazy ex-girlfriend trying to ruin my reputation. Helen practically leaped out of her chair, her face contorted with rage and sudden panic. The perfect suburban matriarch facade was entirely gone, replaced by a desperate, screeching woman fighting to maintain control over a collapsing narrative. She pointed a shaking finger at me, screaming at the top of her lungs, so the extended family would focus on her instead of Bradley's sweating face. Listen to her. Just listen to her, Helen shrieked, waving her arms frantically. This is exactly what we have been talking about all afternoon. Stella is having a complete psychotic break right in front of us. She is making up wild, delusional stories to avoid taking responsibility for her own pathetic life. Helen turned frantically to Aunt Brenda and Uncle Tom, grabbing her own hair in a show of intense distress. Bradley is a good, honest man. He is the chief financial officer of a multi-million-dollar venture capital company. Why on earth would a man with his wealth and status ever need to steal a paltry $25,000 from a broke college dropout? Stella is completely detached from reality. She is projecting her own financial ruin onto a successful, brilliant man because she is bitter and deeply unwell. Do not listen to a single word coming out of her crazy mouth. She needs to be locked up today. I let Helen scream herself hoarse. I watched her wave her arms and point her trembling fingers until she literally ran out of breath. When her shrieking finally subsided into heavy, furious panting, the silence in the room returned thicker and more suffocating than before. Everyone stared at me, waiting for the psychiatric meltdown they were so certain was coming. Instead, I calmly reached forward with my right hand. I placed my fingertips on the edge of the thick manila folder containing the quitclaim deed. With one smooth, deliberate motion, I slid the entire stack of fraudulent legal documents back across the glass coffee table. It stopped precisely an inch away from Richard's tightly clenched fists. "I am not signing a single page," I said, my voice completely devoid of the fear they so desperately wanted to hear. "But since we are all gathered here today to discuss financial stability and the preservation of the Evans family legacy, I actually have a much better question for everyone in this circle." I shifted my gaze from the rejected paperwork up to my father. Richard looked like he was about to experience a spontaneous cardiac event. The vein on his temple was throbbing visibly. He was utterly unaccustomed to being defied in his own home, let alone by the daughter he had systematically designated as the family failure. "You truly believe that putting a lien on a historic Newport property is the magic bullet here?" I continued, tilting my head slightly as I analyzed his aggressive posture. "You really think that taking a desperate high-interest commercial bridge loan against a house worth barely $1.2 million is going to save your golden boy? Tell me, Richard, as a man who prides himself on his impeccable business acumen, does that math actually compute in your head? Connor runs a venture capital fund that you constantly brag is worth hundreds of millions. Why on earth would a titan of Silicon Valley need to cannibalize his dead grandmother's estate for a measly $1 million in liquid cash?" Richard opened his mouth to shout another demanding order, but the logical discrepancy of my question had already hung in the air. For the first time all afternoon, I saw a flicker of genuine uncertainty cross Uncle Tom's face. Aunt Brenda stopped twisting her pearl necklace and looked at Richard, waiting for an explanation that made financial sense. Connor immediately jumped in to control the damage. He adjusted his posture, forcing a loud, dismissive laugh that echoed awkwardly in the quiet room. "Do not listen to her," Connor announced to the room, waving his hand in my direction as if swatting away an annoying insect. "She does not understand how high-level corporate finance works. Capital gets tied up in long-term equity holds. It is a temporary liquidity crunch caused by aggressive market expansion. We are finalizing a massive Series C funding round next week. I just need a minor bridge facility to cover operational overhead until the institutional money clears. It is standard Silicon Valley procedure." She is just a broke, uneducated dropout trying to sound smart using words she heard on television. I did not flinch at his insults. I simply turned my head and locked my eyes directly onto my brother. I watched the way his tailored suit jacket rose and fell with his rapid breathing. I watched the tiny bead of sweat tracing its way down his temple. He was projecting absolute arrogance to the aunts and uncles, but his eyes were screaming with pure, unadulterated panic. "A minor bridge facility to cover operational overhead," I repeated, nodding slowly, as if deeply impressed by his vocabulary. "That is a truly fascinating way to describe your current situation, Connor. It sounds so much better than the truth." I paused, letting the tension stretch until it felt like the glass table might shatter under the weight of it. Bradley, standing near the archway, suddenly went incredibly rigid. As the chief financial officer of the fund, he knew exactly what was buried in their corporate ledgers. "Connor," I said, dropping the pleasant conversational tone entirely. My voice became a sharp surgical scalpel cutting straight through his carefully constructed lies. "Have you told Mom and Dad yet? Have you informed Aunt Brenda and Uncle Tom and every other relative sitting in this circle who handed you their entire life savings? Have you told them that your spectacular venture capital fund is currently the target of an active, massive federal investigation? The air was instantly sucked out of the room. Connor's face turned the color of wet ash. His mouth fell open, but absolutely no sound came out. Have you explained to the family that the Securities and Exchange Commission has been quietly auditing your books for the past 4 months? I continued, my voice ringing with total authority. Have you mentioned the subpoenas? Have you told them that the SEC has officially moved to freeze your primary operating accounts because they found glaring discrepancies in your portfolio valuation? You are not experiencing a temporary liquidity crunch due to aggressive market expansion. You are being hunted by federal regulators for multiple counts of wire fraud and the gross misappropriation of investor funds. The silence that followed was absolute and terrifying. No one breathed. No one moved. The horrific reality of my words slammed into the room like a freight train. The Securities and Exchange Commission was not a term anyone in that affluent Connecticut suburb took lightly. It was the ultimate financial death sentence. Aunt Brenda let out a short, choked gasp, her hand flying to her chest. She had refinanced her own home just 3 years ago to invest in Connor's guaranteed high-yield fund. Uncle Tom's face morphed from angry red to a sickly pale white. He slowly turned his head to look at Connor, his eyes wide with a sudden dawning terror. Helen tried to speak, her voice coming out as a weak, trembling whisper. What is she talking about, Connor? Tell her she is lying. Tell her to shut her crazy mouth. But Connor could not speak. The golden child, the billionaire prodigy, the absolute pride of the Evans family, was completely paralyzed. He stared at me with wide, terrified eyes, realizing in real time that the sister he had thrown away to die in the gutter was the exact person holding the match to his gasoline-soaked empire. Bradley took a slow, silent step backward toward the front door, his survival instincts kicking in as he realized the federal government was already breathing down their necks. The entire living room held its breath, waiting for the golden boy to defend himself, but the silence only proved his guilt. The absolute silence in the living room shattered with the explosive, violent sound of Connor slamming both of his fists down onto the thick glass coffee table. The impact was so severe that the crystal wine glasses rattled violently, and the vintage bottle of Cabernet Sauvignon I had brought tipped dangerously to the side before righting itself. Connor shot up from his chair as if he had been physically burned. His previously pale face flooded with a dark, furious crimson that spread from his neck all the way to the roots of his perfectly styled hair. The composed, arrogant Silicon Valley billionaire facade evaporated entirely, leaving behind a frantic, cornered animal. "You are a pathological liar!" Connor roared, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. His voice cracked with an ugly mixture of rage and raw panic. "How dare you walk into this house and spew this absolute garbage? My fund is returning 30% year over year. 30%. We are outperforming every single benchmark index in the industry. I have institutional investors practically begging to give me their capital. You know absolutely nothing about high-level corporate finance, and you clearly have no idea how the Securities and Exchange Commission operates." He turned wildly to the rest of the room, throwing his arms wide in a desperate attempt to herd the family back under his control. Do not listen to a single word coming out of her mouth. The SEC conducts routine compliance audits on every major venture capital firm in California. It is a standard operational procedure. It means absolutely nothing. She heard a rumor, or she read some generic financial blog, and her diseased, paranoid mind spun it into a wild conspiracy theory. She is completely insane. She has always been insane. Helen did not even need a second invitation to join the attack. The moment Connor provided a plausible excuse, she latched onto it with terrifying ferocity. She leaped from her chair, her face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated venom. She completely abandoned any lingering pretense of maternal concern. "You spiteful, envious little wretch!" Helen screamed, her voice echoing shrilly off the high ceilings. "You have spent 5 years festering in your own failure, plotting how to destroy your brother, just because you could never measure up to him. You are jealous. You are consumed by jealousy because Connor has built a spectacular life while you have done nothing but humiliate us. He bought your father and me a villa in Tuscany last year. He flies us first class across the world. He is a titan of industry. And you? You are a pathetic nobody trying to tear down a successful man out of pure bitter spite. Richard stepped forward, his chest puffed out, positioning himself physically between me and his golden boy. He pointed his finger at me like a loaded weapon. I will have you arrested for defamation. Richard threatened, his voice a low, dangerous growl. I will hire the best lawyers in the state of Connecticut, and I will personally see to it that you are sued into absolute oblivion for trying to slander the Evans name and sabotage your brother's firm. You come into my house on Easter Sunday and fabricate federal investigations. You truly are a sick, twisted individual. Connor is the crown jewel of this family. We will protect him, and we will destroy you for trying to ruin his reputation. I remained perfectly seated in my chair. I did not flinch when Connor slammed the table. I did not shrink back when Helen screamed in my face. I did not cower when Richard threatened to destroy me legally. I simply rested my hands in my lap and observed them. It was a fascinating psychological study. They were aggressively doubling down on the lie, violently protecting the very man who was actively pushing them all toward total financial ruin. From the edge of the circle, Aunt Brenda suddenly spoke up. Her voice was trembling and her hands gripped her designer handbag so tightly that her knuckles had turned completely white. She had dumped her entire retirement savings, along with Uncle Tom's pension, straight into Connor's fund just 2 years ago, lured by the promise of his miraculous 30% returns. The mere mention of the SEC had clearly sent a jolt of ice-cold terror straight down her spine, but the cognitive dissonance was simply too powerful for her to accept the truth. She needed Connor to be a genius. The alternative was living in a cardboard box for the rest of her life. Connor is telling the truth, Brenda said, her voice high and breathless, laced with a desperate pleading tone. He sends me the quarterly statements himself. I see the numbers, Stella. I look at the portfolio returns every single month. My account balance goes up. The graphs show consistent growth. Connor is brilliant. You are just trying to scare us because you have absolutely nothing to your name, and you want us to feel as miserable as you do. Uncle Tom immediately nodded, wrapping a protective arm around his wife's shaking shoulders. He glared at me with deep hostility. Your aunt is right. We know exactly where our money is. Connor is a financial visionary. You are just a bitter dropout trying to cause a scene because you cannot stand the fact that we all chose to invest in your brother instead of bailing you out of your miserable life 5 years ago. You are a disgusting, vindictive person, Stella. Connor seized on their desperate loyalty immediately. He puffed out his chest, attempting to reclaim his alpha male posture. See, Connor sneered, looking down at me with absolute contempt. My investors trust me. My family trusts me. You have no proof of anything because there is nothing to prove. You are a delusional, jealous woman sitting in a room full of successful people trying to drag us down to your pathetic level. Now sign the quitclaim deed so I can get back to running my empire, and then get the hell out of my parents' house before I call the police and have you dragged away for trespassing. I let his words hang in the air for a long moment. I listened to the heavy, angry breathing of my parents and the anxious shifting of my relatives. They had formed a unified, impenetrable wall of denial around the golden child. They were entirely convinced that my accusations were nothing more than the unhinged ramblings of a failed daughter. They believed that because I had arrived without a shouting lawyer or a flashy presentation, I was completely empty-handed. They thought Connor had successfully deflected the threat and stabilized the room. I reached out and picked up my crystal wine glass. I took a very slow, very deliberate sip of the Cabernet Sauvignon, letting the silence stretch until it became physically uncomfortable for everyone in the room. I swallowed the wine and set the glass down with a soft, precise clink. I offered Connor a bright, terrifyingly calm smile. He thought he had won the argument by shouting the loudest and throwing around technical jargon. He had absolutely no idea that I had not even begun to fight. I placed my wine glass on the coffee table and reached into my leather tote bag. My movements were slow, calculated, and entirely deliberate. I pulled out a sleek silver iPad Pro. The room watched in tense silence as my fingers glided across the smooth glass screen. I swiped down from the top right corner and tapped the screen mirroring icon. A soft chime echoed from the massive 85-inch smart TV mounted directly above the stone fireplace. The screen flickered to life. My parents' customized family portrait screensaver instantly vanished, replaced by a high-resolution, glaringly bright financial dashboard. The display was dominated by complex data architecture. Thick red and black lines zigzagged across a detailed chronological timeline, spanning exactly 36 months. Dozens of offshore routing numbers were neatly mapped alongside highlighted domestic wire transfers. In the top left corner, a highly classified case file number sat next to the official seal of the Securities and Exchange Commission, flanked by the emblem of the United States Department of Justice. I stood up from the wooden chair. 30% year-over-year returns, I said, projecting my voice so it carried to every corner of the vast room. That is a truly magnificent fairy tale, Connor. I tapped the screen of my tablet and the television zoomed in on a specific cluster of red data points. The brutal reality is that your spectacular venture capital fund has not generated a single cent of legitimate profit in exactly 3 years. You have 0 successful acquisitions. You have 0 active equity holds. You do not even have a functional trading algorithm. Connor scrambled backward, his back hitting the edge of the plush sofa. The color had completely drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. What you are looking at is a forensic cash flow analysis, I explained to the paralyzed room. It is a classic textbook Ponzi scheme. Your golden boy is not a financial visionary. He is just a desperate criminal playing a massive, extremely illegal shell game. I tapped the screen again. The chart shifted to display specific transaction ledgers, highlighting names and dollar amounts in stark, unforgiving black text. I looked directly at my aunt, who was currently clutching her chest as if she could physically hold her racing heart in place. Let us look at a real-world example, I said gently. Aunt Brenda, 2 years ago, you and Uncle Tom wired $400,000 from your retirement accounts directly into Connor's primary intake fund. The glossy quarterly statements he sends you claim that money was invested in emerging medical technologies. I pointed a firm finger at the television screen. Here is where your hard-earned money actually went. 48 hours after your wire transfer cleared, Connor routed $200,000 to pay off the overdue returns of his initial investors, just to keep them from reporting him to the authorities. He used $50,000 to cover his personal corporate credit card debt, and Bradley, his brilliant chief financial officer, diverted another $50,000 into a private offshore holding account in the Cayman Islands to hide it from domestic tax auditors. The remaining $100,000 is completely gone, swallowed by exorbitant operational overhead and luxury car leases. Your retirement fund does not exist anymore, Aunt Brenda. Connor stole it to buy himself time. Brenda let out a guttural, suffocating gasp. She slumped forward, burying her face in her trembling hands as she began to hyperventilate. Uncle Tom grabbed the edges of his chair, staring at the television screen with an expression of pure, unadulterated horror. The undeniable mathematical proof was staring them right in the face. Bradley, standing near the hallway archway, suddenly looked like he was going to vomit. As the chief financial officer, he recognized those offshore routing numbers intimately. He knew the game was completely over. Helen rushed toward the television, frantically waving her hands in the air as if she could physically wipe the damning data off the glowing screen. "Where did you get this?" Helen shrieked, her voice cracking with wild hysteria. "These are fabricated. You hacked into his computer. You are a cyber criminal trying to frame your own brother because you are sick in the head." "I did not hack into anything," I replied, my voice slicing through her pathetic panic with absolute icy authority. These documents were legally obtained through a federal subpoena. The Securities and Exchange Commission did not just wake up one morning and randomly decide to audit Connor. They received a massive anonymous data dump from a whistleblower inside his own ranks. The federal government quickly realized the sheer scale of the fraud was far too complex for their standard accounting division to untangle. They needed specialized top-tier forensic data analysts to unearth the offshore accounts and trace the convoluted cryptocurrency laundering channels that Bradley set up to hide the stolen cash. I walked right up to my brother, standing just inches away from his trembling, cowardly frame. So the United States government contracted an elite independent cybersecurity and financial forensics firm to completely dismantle your entire criminal enterprise, I said, looking him dead in his terrified eyes. And by pure absolute coincidence, the firm they hired to track down every single stolen dollar the company currently holding your entire future in the palm of its hand is my company. I am the founder and chief executive officer of Vanguard Data Forensics. I am the lead investigator on your federal case. I built the specific algorithm that caught you. I am the one who handed your entire fraudulent empire over to the federal prosecutors. Connor felt his knees completely give out. He collapsed onto the expensive Persian rug, landing heavily on his hands and knees. The arrogant, untouchable billionaire was completely erased from existence, replaced by a broken, hyperventilating criminal staring at the floor in sheer terror. Richard stood frozen by his armchair, his mouth hanging wide open as the horrific realization finally sank into his thick skull. The daughter he had thrown away, the woman he had just ordered to sign over $1 million estate to save his family, was the exact same federal contractor who had just signed his golden child's one-way ticket to federal prison. The revelation hung in the air like a live grenade that had just detonated. For a fraction of a second, the 13 people in the living room remained absolutely petrified, their brains desperately trying to process the magnitude of what they had just witnessed on the television screen. The brightly colored financial charts showing their emptied bank accounts were undeniable. The official federal seals were terrifyingly real. The facade of the wealthy, supportive, and superior Evans family completely shattered into a million jagged pieces right in front of my eyes. Aunt Brenda let out a sound that was half shriek and half animalistic sob. She dropped her designer handbag directly onto the hardwood floor, the expensive leather slapping loudly against the wood. She lunged forward entirely, abandoning her polished country club persona. She grabbed Connor by the lapels of his custom Italian suit, her manicured nails digging fiercely into the expensive fabric. She hauled him partially off the Persian rug, shaking him with a frantic, terrifying strength, fueled entirely by the sudden realization of total financial ruin. "Where is it?" Brenda screamed, her face inches from his pale, sweating features. "Where is our retirement money, you miserable little thief? You looked me dead in the eye at Thanksgiving and told me my investments were doubling. You told me we were securing our future. We remortgaged our house for you. We gave you everything we had worked for over 40 years. Tell me that money is still there. Tell me you did not throw my entire life away." Uncle Tom did not try to hold his wife back. Instead, he marched right up to the kneeling golden boy, his face a dangerous shade of dark purple. Tom kicked the side of the glass coffee table, making everyone flinch. He demanded answers, his voice a booming roar of absolute betrayal. The other relatives in the room instantly caught the contagion of panic. Cousins who had smugly insulted me just 20 minutes earlier were now hyperventilating, pulling out their phones, desperately trying to log into their investment portals, only to find the servers completely unresponsive and their accounts locked. The meticulously planned intervention officially devolved into a feral, screaming mob. Two of my older cousins cornered Richard, demanding to know if he was complicit in the massive fraud. They shouted about drained college funds, ruined credit scores, and second mortgages they could no longer afford. The elegant Connecticut living room transformed into an absolute war zone of pointing fingers, red faces, and raw, unfiltered terror. They were turning on each other like starved wolves, completely ignoring my presence in the room as they fought to salvage whatever scraps of their lives remained. Connor was completely pathetic. The charismatic Silicon Valley titan was entirely gone. He scrambled backward across the rug, trying to escape Brenda's, grip his expensive leather shoes, slipping uselessly against the fabric. He held his hands up in front of his face, cowering from his own family. He stuttered uncontrollably, unable to form a single coherent sentence. He mumbled broken, nonsensical phrases about market fluctuations, delayed wire transfers, and temporary administrative freezes. No one believed a single word. They could all see the offshore Cayman Islands accounts, glowing brightly on the smart television right above his head. Helen tried to throw her body between Connor and the furious relatives. She waved her arms wildly, trying to physically block Aunt Brenda from grabbing him again. "Stop it!" Helen shrieked, her voice cracking with pure desperation. "Stop attacking my son! You are all letting Stella manipulate you!" She fabricated that entire presentation. "Connor is a good man. He is a billionaire. He will pay everyone back with interest." But Helen had entirely lost her audience. Her social currency had flatlined the moment the word fraud left my mouth. Uncle Tom glared at her with pure disgust. "Shut your mouth, Helen!" Tom bellowed, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "Look at the screen. Your golden boy is a con artist. He stole our money to buy you luxury cars and European vacations, and now we are all going to lose our homes. Do not you dare try to defend him." Desperate, cornered, and suffocating under the weight of his own imploding empire, Connor frantically scanned the chaotic room. He needed an ally. He needed someone who spoke the language of corporate finance to spin a lie convincing enough to buy him time to run. He looked toward the hallway archway, his eyes wide and pleading. Bradley Connor gasped out, his voice hoarse and terrified. "Tell them! Tell them the Series C funding is clearing tomorrow. Tell them the liquidity is locked in escrow. Explain the offshore tax strategy to them." Every furious eye in the living room immediately snapped toward the archway, but Bradley was not stepping forward to save his business partner. The slick, arrogant chief financial officer had correctly assessed the survival odds in the room, and he had chosen himself. Bradley was silently, methodically inching his way along the wall, sliding toward the heavy French doors that led to the backyard patio. He kept his head down, actively avoiding Connor's desperate gaze. He was leaving the golden child to be entirely devoured by the angry mob. He knew the federal agents were already mobilizing, and he was desperately trying to calculate how fast he could get to the nearest international airport before his passport was flagged. I sat perfectly still in my chair, taking a slow sip of my Cabernet Sauvignon, and watched the magnificent spectacle unfold. The pristine, highly curated world of the Evans family was burning to the ground right in front of my eyes, ignited by their own bottomless greed and absolute arrogance. Richard was a survivor, above all else. I watched the gears turning behind his dark eyes as he rapidly calculated the precise moment his golden boy transformed from a lucrative financial asset into a massive radioactive liability. He looked at the furious red faces of his siblings and in-laws. If he stood by Connor now, the mob would tear him apart and drag his own pristine reputation straight into the federal indictment. So Richard did exactly what he had always done. He protected himself. He stepped forward, grabbing Connor roughly by the collar of his ruined designer suit. He hauled his son upward and delivered a staggering, open-handed slap directly across his face. The sharp crack of skin on skin echoed over the screaming relatives. Connor stumbled backward, clutching his reddened cheek in absolute shock, staring at his father in complete disbelief. Richard puffed out his chest, instantly adopting the role of the profoundly betrayed patriarch. "How could you do this to your own blood?" Richard roared, his voice dripping with loud theatrical outrage. "We trusted you implicitly. We gave you everything a son could ever ask for. You lied to me, you lied to your mother, and you stole the hard-earned money of this family. You are an absolute disgrace to the Evans name." It was a magnificent performance, entirely devoid of any genuine emotional depth. Richard was sacrificing his pawn to save his own king. But the relatives were not buying the cheap theatrical performance. The financial damage was far too severe for a simple slap to fix. Uncle Tom pulled his smartphone from his jacket pocket, his hands shaking violently as he punched the screen. "I am calling the authorities right now!" Tom yelled over Richard's performance. "I am calling the Federal Bureau. I am freezing every single bank account associated with this family. You are going to rot in a concrete cell. Connor and I will personally testify against you. Helen realized the staged physical discipline had completely failed. The mob was out for blood, and her perfect, flawless son was seconds away from being handcuffed and dragged out of his luxury life forever. The polished, arrogant country club matriarch entirely snapped. The reality of a federal prison sentence shattered her carefully maintained delusion. She frantically scanned the chaotic room and locked her wild, tear-filled eyes entirely on me. Helen lunged across the Persian rug. She practically threw herself at my feet, her manicured hands clamping down hard on my forearms. Her grip was bruising, desperate, and terrifyingly strong. The sheer whiplash of her behavioral shift was staggering. 10 minutes ago, she was aggressively trying to force me into a locked psychiatric ward so she could steal my inheritance. Now she was clinging to the sleeves of my custom suit like a drowning sailor holding onto a wooden life raft. Stella, listen to me. Helen hyperventilated, her breath hot and ragged against my space. You are the chief executive officer of this data firm. You are the one in charge of the entire federal audit. You built the tracking algorithm that found these accounts. That means you have top-tier administrative access. You have the government security clearance. You can log into their servers right now and delete the entire financial report. I stared down at her, absolutely fascinated by the bottomless depth of her moral bankruptcy. She was not asking for an apology. She was demanding that I actively commit a massive federal cybercrime against the United States government. You can alter the numbers, Stella. She shook my arms, her eyes wide with manic, delusional hope. You can reroute the data packets. You can make it look like a simple accounting error. Tell the Securities and Exchange Commission that your software malfunctioned. Tell them the offshore accounts belong to a completely different corporation. You are brilliant with computers. You always were so smart. You can erase all of this evidence before they issue the final arrest warrants. Nobody else has to know. I did not pull my arms away. I simply looked down at her gripping hands, feeling the absolute frantic entitlement radiating from her pores. She was entirely willing to sacrifice me all over again. She wanted me to burn my legitimate, hard-earned empire to the ground, risk decades in a federal penitentiary, and destroy my entire life just to shield the son who had robbed our extended family blind. He is your biological brother. Helen shrieked, her voice echoing with raw desperation as she realized I was not immediately nodding in agreement. He shares your exact blood. You cannot just sit there and watch him go to a federal prison. He will not survive in a place like that, Stella. They will tear a boy like him apart. You have to save him right now. You owe this family your life. She dug her nails deeper into my skin, using the ultimate toxic guilt trip she had weaponized against me since childhood. We put a solid roof over your head for 2 decades, Helen sobbed, completely abandoning any shred of personal dignity. We fed you every single day. We raised you. We gave you the very life you are living right now. You owe us this one favor to repay the massive debt of your existence. Just log into your computer and erase his name. Do it for your mother. Do it for the family. I looked from Helen crying on the floor to Richard, who was silently watching with a glimmer of hope that my manipulation might actually work. They had absolutely no shame. They had no remorse for the millions stolen from Aunt Brenda or Uncle Tom. They only cared about preserving their golden child and avoiding the social humiliation of a criminal trial. They demanded my absolute ruin as the price of my admission back into their toxic fold. I ripped my arms out of Helen's desperate grip with such sudden violent force that she collapsed backward onto the expensive Persian rug. The dull thud of her body hitting the floor echoed sharply in the perfectly silent living room. I stood up to my full height, towering over the woman who had spent my entire existence trying to make me feel completely insignificant. I smoothed the front of my tailored blazer, staring down at her tear-stained, pathetic face with absolute zero sympathy. I owe this family my life, I repeated, my voice dropping into a register so cold and sharp it felt like a physical weapon slicing through the heavy air. You actually have the sheer audacity to sit on the floor of a house bought with stolen money and tell me that I owe you a debt of gratitude. I turned my gaze away from her and swept my eyes across the circle of relatives. Aunt Brenda was still clutching her chest, her breathing shallow and ragged. Uncle Tom was staring at the floor, completely shell-shocked. The cousins were paralyzed, entirely trapped in the blast radius of our family implosion. I wanted every single one of them to hear the absolute, unfiltered truth. I wanted the carefully curated Evans family mythology burned to ash. "Let us talk about what I truly owe this family," I announced, projecting my voice so it commanded every inch of the vaulted living room. "Let us go back exactly 11 years. Let us talk about my 22nd year of life. Let us talk about the $150,000 college fund that my grandfather explicitly left to guarantee my future independence." Richard suddenly stepped forward, raising his hands in a frantic, desperate attempt to stop the narrative. "Stella, that is enough," Richard commanded, though his authoritative voice shook violently with sudden panic. "Do not bring up ancient family history. This is neither the time nor the place for these wild accusations." "You do not get to dictate the time or the place ever again, Richard." I snapped back, my eyes locking onto his with unwavering, lethal intensity. I watched him physically recoil from my gaze. I turned back to the audience of horrified relatives. "You all remember that year. You all remember when Helen and Richard told the entire extended family that my college fund was lost in a terrible mutual fund collapse. They spun a tragic, highly convincing story about a fraudulent broker and terrible market inflation. They played the devastated victims perfectly. But that was a spectacular, monumental lie." I pointed a rigid finger directly at Connor, who was still cowering on the floor, actively avoiding everyone's gaze. "That money did not evaporate in the stock market. Richard and Helen marched into the bank and drained every single cent of my future to pay off a massive, highly illegal string of bribes. They took my education fund to silence a team of aggressive defense lawyers, a corrupt local police chief, and a severely injured pedestrian. They drained my account because their precious, perfect golden boy Connor got completely blackout drunk, wrapped his luxury sports car around a concrete streetlight, and committed a felony hit-and-run. A collective gasp ripped through the living room. Aunt Brenda covered her mouth with both hands, her eyes wide with sheer terror as she stared down at Connor. Uncle Tom took a physical step away from Richard, treating his own brother like a toxic, dangerous animal. The perfect, pristine image of the Evans family golden boy was not just tarnished, it was entirely obliterated. He was not just a white-collar fraudster who stole their retirement savings. He was a violent, reckless criminal who had left a bleeding victim on the side of the road and let his sister pay the price. But that is not even the darkest part of this story. I continued, refusing to let the momentum drop for even a fraction of a second. I walked closer to Helen, forcing her to look up at the daughter she had tried to destroy. "The real tragedy is what you two monsters did when I finally uncovered the truth. When I was 28 years old, I found the hidden bank statements. I found the paper trail of your bribes and payoffs. I confronted you in this very living room. And you did not just deny your crimes. You actively, systematically destroyed my entire reality." The room was so quiet, I could hear the rapid, anxious breathing of my cousins. "You pinned me down on this very sofa," I said, my voice vibrating with years of suppressed righteous fury. "You forced heavy prescription sedatives down my throat when I tried to call the authorities. You called your high society private doctor and paid him an exorbitant amount of cash to write a fraudulent psychiatric evaluation stating I was suffering from severe paranoid delusions. You locked me in my childhood bedroom. You confiscated my phone and my laptop. And then you went to every single person sitting in this circle right now, and you told them I was experiencing a violent, uncontrollable psychotic break." I looked directly at Aunt Brenda, whose face was completely drenched in tears of horrified realization. "You believed them, Brenda. You all believed them. You looked at me with pity and fear because my own parents convinced the entire world that I was completely insane. They isolated me. They drugged me until I could barely speak, and they discredited me entirely so that my accusations against Connor would sound like the wild, unhinged ramblings of a madwoman. They stole my money, and when I caught them, they tried to steal my mind. They gaslit me into questioning my own sanity just to keep their golden boy out of a prison cell." Helen was weeping on the floor, choking on her own dramatic tears, But nobody moved an inch to comfort her. The profound, sickening realization of her absolute evil had paralyzed the entire room. Aunt Brenda looked at Helen with pure, unfiltered revulsion. The maternal facade had completely rotted away, revealing a monster who had tortured her own daughter to protect a criminal son. "You sacrificed my sanity to protect your ego," I finalized, staring down at my parents with absolute disgust. "You stole my future to build his fraudulent empire, and now you have the absolute gall to beg me to compromise my own federal firm to save him from the consequences of his own greed. You do not deserve my mercy, Helen. You are finally going to get exactly what you deserve." The sheer gravity of my revelation hung over the living room like a thick layer of toxic smoke. Uncle Tom had physically backed away from Richard, shielding his wife as if my parents carried a highly contagious disease. The cousins were whispering frantically, their eyes darting toward the front door, desperate to escape the rotting core of the Evans family. The intervention had utterly collapsed, transforming into a crime scene waiting for the authorities. In the midst of this overwhelming chaotic paralysis, a figure in a tailored charcoal suit was slowly, methodically inching his way along the perimeter of the room. Bradley, my treacherous former fiancé and the brilliant chief financial officer of my brother's fraudulent empire. While every single eye was locked on Helen weeping on the Persian rug, Bradley had correctly calculated his own survival odds. They were practically zero. He kept his head down, his Italian leather shoes making absolutely no sound against the polished hardwood. He had almost reached the grand foyer. His sweaty hand was literally reaching out to grasp the heavy brass handle of the front door. He was 5 seconds away from slipping into the crisp spring air, jumping into his sports car, and vanishing before the federal agents breached the perimeter. "Bradley, do not even think about turning that doorknob." My voice was not loud, but it cut through the murmuring chaos of the living room with the precision of a sniper bullet. Bradley froze instantly. His hand hovered a mere inch from the brass handle. His spine went entirely rigid beneath his expensive suit jacket. Every relative in the room immediately snapped their attention away from my parents and locked their eyes onto the man trying to quietly abandon a sinking ship. "You really thought you could just quietly slip out the back door while the captain of the ship goes down in flames?" I asked, taking a slow, deliberate step toward the foyer. "You thought you were just an innocent bystander in this entire operation. You thought you could play the role of the oblivious accountant, wipe your hands clean of my brother's spectacular mess, and walk away completely unscathed." Bradley slowly turned around to face me. His perfectly styled hair was now slightly disheveled, and his face was the color of spoiled milk. He forced a weak, utterly unconvincing smile, raising his hands in a gesture of fake surrender. "Stella, be reasonable," Bradley stammered, his voice cracking noticeably under the intense pressure of the silent audience. "I am just a corporate employee. I manage the standard tax compliance. Connor made the executive trading decisions. I had absolutely no idea the primary portfolios were completely fabricated. I am a victim here too. I have to go call my own legal counsel." I let out a sharp, genuine laugh that made him flinch. "A victim? That is a brilliant legal defense, Bradley. It is truly inspiring. But as a premier forensic data analyst, I deal strictly in mathematical realities, not pathetic fairy tales. I do not just look at the domestic intake accounts. I trace the exit routes. I follow the digital breadcrumbs that desperate men leave behind when they realize the house of cards is about to collapse." I pointed a firm finger directly at his chest. "You are not a victim. You are a parasite who feeds on other parasites. As the chief financial officer, you knew exactly how rapidly Connor's venture capital fund was bleeding cash. You saw the red ink spreading across the corporate ledgers 6 months ago. But instead of reporting the massive fraud to the regulatory authorities, you decided to carve out your own golden parachute." Connor, who had been curled up on the floor in a state of absolute despair, slowly lifted his head. He looked at his best friend and trusted financial officer with deep, sudden confusion. "What is she talking about?" Connor croaked out, his voice raw. I kept my eyes locked entirely on Bradley, watching the sheer terror finally break through his arrogant facade. "I am talking about the $2 million in raw capital that mysteriously evaporated from your secondary liquidity pool last quarter," I explained, making sure my brother heard every single agonizing detail. While Connor was busy staging fake investor meetings and buying luxury cars to keep up appearances, his brilliant chief financial officer was quietly bleeding the company dry from the inside. Bradley set up a highly encrypted offshore holding account in the Cayman Islands under a shell corporation registered in Belize. He used a complex layering technique, funneling the stolen investor money through 3 different cryptocurrency exchanges just to mask the wire transfers. $2 million, Bradley. Siphoned right out of the pockets of the people sitting in this very room, hidden away for your own personal escape plan. A collective gasp ripped through the living room. Aunt Brenda clutched her chest again. Connor stared at Bradley with pure, unfiltered hatred, realizing he had been robbed blind by his own accomplice. "You stole from me!" Connor screamed, his voice breaking with disbelief. "You stole my money!" "It was not your money, Connor," I snapped back, shutting him down instantly. "It was stolen money to begin with. Bradley just stole it twice." Bradley backed up until his shoulders hit the heavy oak door. He was visibly hyperventilating now, his chest heaving under his tailored suit. "You cannot prove any of that," he gasped out frantically, shaking his head. "Those accounts are heavily encrypted. They are protected by international privacy laws. You are making wild accusations. International privacy laws do not apply to active federal indictments involving massive wire fraud." I informed him thoroughly, enjoying the complete destruction of his ego. "I cracked your amateur encryption protocols in less than 48 hours. I have the complete digital ledger. I have the exact timestamps of every single wire transfer you authorized. But more importantly, Bradley, I have the final destination of those funds." I took another step closer, lowering my voice into a cold, lethal register. "You thought you were so incredibly smart. You thought you could run away to a tropical island and start a new life with your new wealthy wife. Rebecca Wright, the beautiful heiress you married last year to elevate your social status in the city. The woman who prides herself on her immaculate reputation and her flawless credit score." Bradley's eyes widened to the size of saucers at the mention of his wife's name. A soft whimper escaped his throat. I pulled my smartphone from my pocket and tapped the screen. "I did not just hand your offshore bank statements over to the Securities and Exchange Commission," I told him, watching his entire world crumble to ash. "At exactly 8 o'clock this morning, I sent a highly detailed, fully verified portfolio of your financial crimes directly to Rebecca's personal email address. I included the Cayman Island routing numbers, the cryptocurrency receipts, and a very clear explanation of how the federal government handles marital assets in a major fraud prosecution." Bradley let out a choked, desperate sound. He grabbed his own hair, his perfectly manicured exterior completely dissolving. I also included a pre-drafted set of divorce papers, prepared by a top-tier family law attorney. I finalized driving the final nail straight into his coffin. I attached a note explaining that the Department of Justice will absolutely seize her personal bank accounts, her cars, and her family home to pay off your federal restitution debts unless she legally severs all ties with you immediately. Rebecca does not strike me as the kind of woman who enjoys carrying the heavy burden of federal debt, Bradley. She is not going to stand by a bankrupt criminal who lied to her from day one. She is going to completely destroy you in civil court before the federal prosecutors even get a chance to put you in handcuffs." The absolute finality of my words struck him with the force of a physical blow. Bradley realized he had nothing left. The stolen money was frozen. The fraudulent company was dead. His wealthy wife was currently packing his bags and changing the locks on their luxury apartment. His grand escape plan had been entirely neutralized by the very woman he had betrayed 5 years ago. His legs simply gave out beneath him. The expensive charcoal suit crumpled as Bradley collapsed heavily onto his knees. He hit the polished hardwood floor with a dull thud, his hands dropping limply to his sides. He stared blankly at the bottom of the front door, his mouth opening and closing silently like a suffocating fish. The slick, manipulative financial officer was completely gone, replaced by a broken, ruined man waiting for the federal agents to drag him away. The heavy thud of Bradley collapsing onto the polished hardwood floor should have been the final definitive end to the confrontation. The chief financial officer of the fraudulent venture capital fund was currently hyperventilating against the baseboards, his expensive suit wrinkled and ruined. Connor was still curled on the Persian rug in a state of absolute catatonic shock. The sheer volume of incriminating financial evidence glowing on the massive smart television was mathematically indisputable. Any rational human being would have looked at the offshore routing numbers and immediately surrendered to the devastating reality of the situation. But Helen was not a rational human being. She was a deeply narcissistic suburban matriarch whose entire identity, social standing, and personal ego were directly tethered to the flawless reputation of her golden child. The prospect of losing her country club memberships, her luxury vacations, and her pristine image in the wealthy Connecticut community was a fate worse than death itself. She refused to accept defeat. The absolute terror of impending social and financial ruin completely shattered her remaining tether to reality, sending her into a wild, frantic state of aggressive denial. Helen suddenly shot up from the floor. She ignored her trembling son entirely and spun around to face the terrified circle of extended relatives. Her eyes were wide, manic, and shining with a dangerous, feverish intensity. She pointed a sharp, shaking finger directly at the glowing television screen, then whipped her arm around to point directly at my face. "Artificial intelligence!" Helen shrieked, her voice tearing through the silent living room with the force of a physical blow. "It is all artificial intelligence and computer generation. Do not believe a single thing you are seeing on that screen." Aunt Brenda flinched backward, pulling her designer handbag tightly against her chest as Helen lunged toward her. Helen grabbed the armrest of Brenda's chair, her knuckles turning bone-white with the force of her grip. "Look at her, Brenda," Helen commanded, her voice dropping into a frantic, breathless hiss. "Stella just stood there and told us she works in high-level technology. She is a cybersecurity contractor. She knows exactly how to manipulate digital files. She knows how to create deepfake documents and fabricate banking portals. Those government seals up there on the screen are just images she downloaded from the internet and pasted onto a fake presentation. Those offshore accounts are completely computer-generated graphics. She is using highly advanced software to frame your nephew because she is insanely pathologically jealous of his success." I remained perfectly seated, my legs crossed, watching the absolute desperation rolling off her in waves. She was actively attempting to weaponize modern technology buzzwords to completely overwrite a federal indictment. It was a spectacular display of extreme psychological projection. Helen turned to face the rest of the room, throwing her hands wide in a desperate appeal for validation. She raised her voice again, ensuring every cousin and uncle heard her toxic, rewritten history. "Think about who you are listening to," Helen cried out, forcing fresh tears to stream down her flushed cheeks. "You all remember what happened 5 years ago. You all remember how sick she was." Stella completely lost her mind. She suffered a severe, catastrophic mental breakdown. She hallucinated that entire car crash. She fabricated a hit-and-run story because her life was falling apart and she desperately needed an excuse to play the victim. There was no pedestrian. There was no bloody accident. There are absolutely no police records to support her insane narrative. She is a deeply disturbed, paranoid schizophrenic who has spent half a decade sitting in isolation, plotting a psychotic revenge fantasy against a family that only ever tried to love and protect her. Uncle Tom slowly shook his head, looking from the damning financial charts on the screen to Helen's wild, frantic face. The illusion was finally breaking for him, but Helen refused to stop digging. "Do not let her manipulate you," Helen begged, her voice growing increasingly shrill and unhinged. "There is absolutely no proof of any bribes. There is no proof of a cover-up. She is a sick, crazy woman who hates this family. She wants to burn our beautiful life to the ground just to make herself feel important. She wants to destroy everything we have built. Do not believe this crazy girl." Richard immediately recognized the tactical angle his wife was attempting to exploit. If they could successfully discredit my sanity, they could easily dismiss the digital evidence as the elaborate forgery of a bitter, vengeful hacker. He puffed out his chest, adjusting his expensive blazer, and stepped forward to reinforce the delusion. He relied heavily on his persona as the wealthy, intimidating Connecticut patriarch who believed his money and influence could simply purchase a different reality. Defamation of character. Richard roared, his deep voice meant to terrorize the room into total submission. Slander. Libel. Malicious corporate sabotage. I hope you have a phenomenal legal team on retainer, Stella, because I am going to sue you into absolute inescapable poverty. He marched toward the center of the room, pointing aggressively at the television and then at me. I play golf with the most ruthless, aggressive civil litigators on the East Coast. Richard threatened, his face a mask of furious indignation. We will drag your so-called forensic company straight into federal civil court. We will expose you to the entire world as a fraudulent, unhinged lunatic spreading malicious falsehoods. You have zero physical proof of this supposed accident from 5 years ago. You have zero evidence of any bribes or medical manipulation. You are just a bitter, isolated dropout making wild, slanderous accusations to ruin a holiday gathering and extort $1 million property from your own parents. Richard turned his intimidating glare toward the extended relatives, actively trying to bully them into silence. Anyone in this room who listens to this absolute nonsense is legally complicit in her delusions, he warned them sharply. We are the true victims here today. Connor is the victim of a highly sophisticated cyber attack orchestrated by a mentally ill sibling. We will not be blackmailed, and we will not be intimidated by fake digital charts. I did not raise my voice. I did not attempt to interrupt their frantic, coordinated screaming match. I simply sat there and absorbed the sheer magnitude of their delusion. They were loudly and proudly hanging their entire defense on the assumption that my claims were entirely unsubstantiated. They genuinely believed that because 5 years had passed, all the physical evidence of their monstrous crimes had completely dissolved into thin air. They were betting their freedom on the premise that a terrified, drugged 22-year-old girl had not been smart enough to secure an insurance policy before she was driven out of her own home. I looked at Richard, observing the heavy sweat gathering on his brow. I looked at Helen, whose manic, triumphant smile was slowly returning as she convinced herself her gaslighting was actually working. They had successfully backed themselves into the exact corner I had built for them. They demanded undeniable physical proof of their malice. They demanded hard evidence of the cover-up. They dared to call me a paranoid liar in front of the very people they had scammed. It was finally time to grant their request. I let Richard finish his furious, spittle-flecked rant. I let his hollow threats of civil lawsuits and defamation charges bounce off the vaulted ceiling and fade into the heavy, suffocating silence of the living room. I looked at the 13 relatives who were currently holding their collective breath. I looked at Helen, who was still clutching her chest, her eyes darting frantically around the circle to see if her pathetic theatrical performance had successfully convinced anyone that I was a hallucinating madwoman. They wanted physical proof. They demanded hard, undeniable evidence of their monstrosity. They had built their entire defense on the arrogant assumption that because they had physically destroyed my belongings 5 years ago, the past was permanently erased. They truly believed that wealth and intimidation could sanitize their history. I slowly uncrossed my legs and reached back into my structured leather tote bag. I did not pull out a stack of printed papers. I did not pull out a legal brief or a medical chart. I pulled out a small, transparent evidence bag. Inside the thick plastic lay a completely pulverized, severely outdated smartphone. The screen was completely shattered into a dense spiderweb of dead glass. The aluminum casing was violently bent right down the middle, and the battery compartment was completely caved in. It looked like a piece of technological garbage that had been run over by a freight train. I held the clear bag up by the corner, letting the overhead chandelier light catch the jagged edges of the broken glass. I kept my eyes locked entirely on my father. Richard stopped breathing. The aggressive, domineering posture he had just assumed completely collapsed. His broad shoulders visibly slumped, and the aggressive crimson flush on his face instantly drained away, leaving behind a sickly, terrifying shade of chalky white. He recognized the device immediately. Even after half a decade, a guilty man never forgets the exact weapon he used to silence his victim. "Do you remember this, Richard?" I asked, my voice dropping into a deadly quiet register that commanded the absolute attention of every single person in the room. Do you remember pinning my arms behind my back against the kitchen island? Do you remember snatching this exact phone out of my hands, right as the emergency dispatcher answered my call? You slammed it against the granite countertop over and over again until the glass cut your own knuckles. You thought if you smashed the physical device into a dozen pieces, you would smash the truth right along with it. I turned my gaze to my mother. Helen had stopped her frantic pacing. She was staring at the plastic bag, as if it were a venomous snake coiled to strike. "And you, Helen?" I continued, my voice sharp and relentless. "While Richard was busy destroying my only lifeline to the outside world, you were busy dissolving heavy prescription sedatives into a glass of water. You held my jaw open. You forced me to swallow. You watched my eyes roll back, and you proudly told the entire extended family that I was suffering from a severe, uncontrollable psychotic episode. You both genuinely believed that you had won. You thought you had buried the evidence of Connor's hit-and-run accident so deep it would never see the light of day." I lowered the plastic bag and placed it gently next to my wine glass on the coffee table. I reached into my blazer pocket and pulled out my current state-of-the-art smartphone. I swiped the screen, navigating past the financial dashboards that had already destroyed my brother's venture capital fund. "You all look at me and you see a runaway," I told the silent, horrified audience of relatives. "You think I spent the last 5 years hiding in the shadows, cowering in fear, living a miserable life of poverty and shame. You think I cut off all contact just to escape the profound humiliation of being disowned by the great Evans family." I let out a soft, humorless laugh. I shook my head, tapping a specific application on my screen. "I did not run away to hide," I stated, staring directly into Helen's terrified eyes. "I went silent because I needed absolute focus. I endured the humiliation, the poverty, and the isolation because I had a singular driving purpose. I spent 5 grueling years studying cryptography, data architecture, and digital forensics. I worked 16-hour days to become the absolute best in the nation at extracting corrupted data from destroyed hardware. I did not just stumble into the position of a top-tier federal contractor. I built a multi-million-dollar cybersecurity empire entirely out of spite, fueled by the burning desire to rip the truth out of this shattered piece of metal." I held up my current phone. My thumb hovered over a single audio file displayed on the screen. "You can crush the glass, Richard," I said, my voice echoing with pure, unfiltered vindication. "You can snap the casing in half. You can shatter the motherboard. But the flash memory remains. The data survives. It took me 3 years of advanced hardware manipulation to bypass the corrupted sectors of that broken phone. It took me another 2 years to perfectly reconstruct the fragmented audio files captured by the background recording application I had activated right before I walked into the kitchen that night." Helen let out a whimpering, pathetic gasp. She scrambled backward on the Persian rug, shaking her head frantically. "No," Helen whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of her own rapid hyperventilation. "No, you cannot do this. You are lying. You are bluffing." I did not bother to answer her. I simply opened the Bluetooth settings on my device. I scanned the local network and found the mansion's integrated surround sound system. The exact same premium high-fidelity audio system my parents used to play classical music during their pretentious upper-class dinner parties. I tapped the screen and connected my device. A soft electronic chime echoed from the hidden speakers embedded in the ceiling of the living room, signaling a successful pairing. The sheer terror in the room became a physical, suffocating entity. Aunt Brenda grabbed Uncle Tom's arm, her fingernails digging deep into his sleeve. Connor, still kneeling on the floor, amidst his ruined financial empire, squeezed his eyes shut and covered his ears with his hands, acting like a frightened child, waiting for a bomb to detonate. Bradley stood completely frozen by the front door, his eyes wide, realizing the depth of the vengeance I had meticulously orchestrated. "You wanted hard, undeniable proof," I said, my thumb resting lightly against the play button on my screen. "You stood there and dared me to prove my sanity to the very people you scammed. You demanded physical evidence of your monstrous crimes. Let us see how well your defamation lawsuit holds up against your own voices." I did not blink. I did not hesitate. I pressed play. The pristine surround sound system of the mansion crackled to life. A brief burst of static filled the room, followed immediately by the unmistakable, panicked voice of my older brother. Dad. Stella found out the 150,000 is gone. She is threatening to call the police about the accident. She knows I hit that guy. Connor's recorded voice was entirely devoid of the polished billionaire swagger he usually projected. It was the whiny, desperate pitch of a drunk coward, realizing he was about to go to prison. Then came Richard's voice, deep, irritated, and chillingly callous. Calm down and stop whining. Just tell everyone she is hallucinating again. Tell the relatives she is having a manic episode. Aunt Brenda physically recoiled in her chair as she heard my father seamlessly orchestrating the destruction of my sanity. But the absolute worst was yet to come. The audio captured the sharp, ice-cold tone of my mother stepping into the frame. Increase her sedative dosage, Helen ordered on the recording, her voice dripping with sheer, calculated malice. Lock her in her room. I will call Dr. Sterling. I will get him to sign a medical certificate stating she is suffering from severe paranoia-induced depression. This family cannot collapse because of one useless little brat. The recording cut off with a sharp click. The silence that slammed down onto the living room was absolute, suffocating, and heavy with the stench of pure evil. It was a dead, breathless quiet. Nobody moved. Nobody dared to breathe. The digital ghosts of 5 years ago had just materialized in the center of the room and completely incinerated the Evans family legacy. I looked at my mother. Helen was no longer crying. She was entirely frozen, her mouth slightly open, her eyes wide with the terrifying realization that her own recorded voice had just sealed her fate. She could not claim artificial intelligence. She could not claim deepfakes. Every single relative in the room recognized the exact vicious tone she used when she thought no one was listening to her. Richard looked as if he had been physically gutted. He stared blindly at the floor, his broad chest rising and falling in shallow, erratic bursts. The great patriarch of the family had just been exposed as a ruthless monster who had actively drugged his own daughter to protect a felon. Connor pressed his forehead directly against the Persian rug, curling into a tight, pathetic ball. The audio had not just confirmed the gaslighting, it had explicitly confirmed the hit and run. It confirmed that he had left a bleeding pedestrian on the asphalt and ran home to hide behind his parents' money. Uncle Tom slowly stood up from his chair. He did not look at me. He looked directly at Richard. His face was a mask of pure, unfiltered revulsion. "You drugged her," Tom whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of profound shock and violent anger. "You sat at my dining table 5 years ago. You cried into your hands and told me your daughter had lost her mind. You asked for my sympathy, and you were pumping her full of sedatives the entire time." Aunt Brenda was violently shaking her head, tears streaming down her face, ruining her expensive makeup. She looked at Helen as if looking at a total stranger. "You locked your own child in a room," Brenda choked out, backing away toward the edge of the circle. "You paid a doctor to diagnose her with a fake disease just to cover up a crime. You are a monster, Helen. You are a sick, twisted monster." The other cousins were already stepping backward, physically retreating from the center of the room. The people they had looked up to, the wealthy, successful pillars of their social circle, were entirely unmasked as ruthless sociopathic criminals. I reached over and picked up my wine glass again. The crystal felt cool against my fingers. I took a slow sip, savoring the absolute destruction of their false reality. "That is the foundation of your precious golden boy," I announced, my voice cutting through the heavy, horrified silence. "You all handed your life savings over to a man who did not even have the basic human decency to call an ambulance for the person he ran over. You trusted a financial genius who was actually just a cowardly drunk driver hiding behind his mother's checkbook." I stepped forward, closing the distance between myself and my parents. "You wanted to play the victim today, Helen. You wanted to sit in the circle and demand that I sign over my inheritance to save your precious family name. You demanded my loyalty, but you forgot one crucial detail. I do not negotiate with terrorists, and I absolutely do not finance criminals." Richard finally found his voice, though it was nothing more than a pathetic, ragged croak. "Stella, please. We were trying to protect the family. He is your brother. He would have gone to jail." "He belongs in jail, Richard," I snapped back. my eyes blazing with years of accumulated righteous fury. And so do you. You stole $150,000 from my education fund. You committed medical fraud. You orchestrated the illegal detention of a sane adult. You committed perjury on my medical records. I swept my gaze across the terrified, ruined faces of my immediate family. You thought throwing me out onto the street with absolutely nothing would break me. You thought taking my money and destroying my reputation would ensure I never had the resources to fight back. But you severely underestimated my work ethic. I pointed a rigid finger at the television screen, which was still displaying the massive web of offshore bank accounts and federal seals. I did not just survive your abuse, I weaponized it. I turned my trauma into a multi-million-dollar federal contracting firm. I tracked down every single digital footprint you ever left behind. I found the payoff to the private doctor. I found the hush money you wired to the victim of the car crash. I have compiled every single piece of financial evidence regarding your cover-up, and I attached it directly to the Securities and Exchange Commission audit. Helen let out a long, agonizing wail. It was the sound of a woman realizing that her entire life was completely, irreversibly over. She fell forward onto her hands and knees, sobbing uncontrollably onto the expensive rug, but this time nobody rushed to comfort her. Nobody offered her a tissue. She was entirely alone in a room full of people. The horrific reality of her actions had stripped away every single ally she ever had. The uncles, aunts, and cousins were no longer looking at my family with respect or even basic pity. They were looking at them like they were toxic waste. The meticulously organized Easter intervention had officially become a tribunal, and I was the executioner standing over the block. They had invited me here to break me, and instead, I had mathematically, legally, and socially dismantled their entire existence. The heavy thud of the audio recording ending left no room for any further excuses. The damning evidence had completely severed the last remaining thread of the Evans family illusion. I stood there holding my smartphone, watching the absolute horror wash over the faces of the 9 extended relatives who had originally gathered in this room to condemn me. They had arrived today dressed in their pastel Easter best, eagerly preparing to lecture a supposedly unstable, impoverished woman. Now they were trapped in a luxurious crime scene, breathing the same air as a family of clinical sociopaths. The transition from silent shock to active physical disgust was instantaneous. Aunt Brenda slowly pushed herself up from her chair. Her hands were shaking so violently that her gold bracelets clattered against each other. She looked down at Helen, who was still weeping hysterically on the expensive Persian rug. Helen reached a trembling hand upward, her tear-streaked face, begging her sister for just a fraction of sympathy or understanding. She expected Brenda to kneel down and offer comfort. She expected the unbreakable bond of high society suburban sisters to somehow override the horrific crimes that had just been exposed. Brenda did not kneel. She looked at Helen with an expression of such profound, unfiltered revulsion that it made Helen physically recoil. Brenda gathered a thick wad of saliva in her mouth and spat directly onto the antique rug, the spit landing mere inches from Helen's grasping fingers. It was the ultimate unforgivable insult, a primal display of absolute contempt that shattered every single rule of their polite Connecticut upbringing. Helen gasped, pulling her hand back as if she had been burned by fire. Uncle Tom immediately stepped forward and grabbed Brenda's arm, pulling her firmly away from the center of the room. His face was a mask of cold, hard fury. He looked directly into Richard's terrified eyes. "You are a bunch of monsters," Tom stated, his voice echoing loudly in the vaulted living room. "You are sick, twisted monsters, and I will be damned if I ever let my wife or my children near you again. Do not ever call our house. Do not ever speak our names. You are completely dead to us." Those words were the catalyst. The remaining 7 relatives did not just stand up, they scrambled. Total, unadulterated panic erupted within the intervention circle. Aunts, uncles, and cousins practically tripped over the expensive furniture in their desperate rush to escape the toxic blast radius of my parents' collapsing empire. They understood exactly what my presence here meant. They knew that the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Department of Justice were already moving in on Connor. They knew that any further association with Richard and Helen would drag them straight into a massive federal conspiracy investigation. They grabbed their designer coats off the entryway hooks. They snatched their luxury handbags from the side tables. They did not care about the abandoned Easter dinner. They did not care about retrieving the gifts they had brought. They behaved exactly like people fleeing a burning building or a highly infectious plague. They bumped into each other in the grand foyer, their only goal being to put as much physical distance as possible between themselves and the Evans family name. Richard finally snapped out of his paralyzed state. The patriarch realized that his entire social standing, the very foundation of his arrogant identity, was walking right out the front door. He chased after them, his face red with frantic desperation. "Tom, wait!" Richard bellowed, sprinting into the foyer and reaching out to grab his brother-in-law's shoulder. "Brenda, please, you have to listen to me. We can fix this. I will write you a check right now for whatever Connor lost. I will cover your retirement funds personally. We are family. We have to stick together in times of crisis. You cannot just abandon us like this." Tom violently shoved Richard's hand away, nearly knocking the older man off balance. "Keep your dirty blood-soaked money," Tom snarled, shielding Brenda as he opened the heavy oak front door. "I will take my chances in bankruptcy court before I ever take a single dime from a man who drugged his own daughter to cover up a felony. You disgust me, Richard. You all disgust me." The relatives flooded out onto the pristine front porch, rushing down the manicured stone steps toward their parked luxury vehicles. Richard stood in the open doorway, screaming into the crisp spring air. He abandoned his pride entirely. He begged, he pleaded, he promised them lucrative real estate deals and guaranteed financial security. He shouted about decades of loyalty and shared holidays. Nobody looked back. Not a single person turned their head. The loud, chaotic slamming of car doors echoed across the massive estate. Engines roared to life simultaneously. Tires screeched aggressively against the paved driveway as the fleet of expensive cars accelerated toward the main gate, fleeing the property as fast as the law allowed. Richard stood frozen in the open doorway for a long, agonizing minute, watching the taillights disappear down the winding suburban road. The crisp wind blew into the grand foyer, chilling the house. He slowly closed the heavy oak door. The heavy latch clicked into place with a profound, definitive finality. The sound signaled the absolute death of his social empire. He turned around and walked back into the living room. His shoulders were completely slumped. His breathing was heavy and erratic. He looked like a defeated general returning to a slaughtered camp. The sprawling living room, which had been packed with 14 judgmental, arrogant people just 1 hour ago, was now remarkably empty. The intervention circle was completely destroyed. Chairs were pushed aside, tipped over, or abandoned haphazardly. The room felt massive, hollow, and hauntingly quiet. There were exactly 5 people left inside the house. Connor was still curled tightly on the Persian rug, clutching his knees to his chest, rocking back and forth in a state of catatonic shock. Helen was sitting on the floor, staring blankly at the spot where her own sister had spat on her, her perfectly styled hair now a messy, tangled disaster around her tear-stained face. Bradley was glued to the wall near the archway, his arms wrapped around his own torso, looking like a trapped rat calculating if he could survive jumping through a closed glass window. Richard stood at the edge of the room, completely stripped of his power, his wealth, and his dignity. And then there was me. I remained standing in the exact center of the room, perfectly poised, completely untouched by the carnage surrounding me. I picked up my crystal wine glass from the coffee table, observing the rich red liquid swirling inside. I took a slow, satisfying sip. The evacuation was a spectacular success. The audience had fled, leaving only the guilty parties behind, to face the final, inescapable execution. I lowered my glass and offered my ruined family a bright, terrifying smile. The massive living room was completely devoid of its former holiday warmth. The sudden absence of the extended family left a deafening void, amplifying every ragged breath and desperate sob coming from the 4 ruined people trapped inside with me. I stood perfectly still, my posture straight, holding my wine glass. The power dynamic in the house had completely inverted. I was no longer the outcast daughter begging for scraps of affection. I was the absolute authority in the room, holding the key to their literal freedom. Connor broke the silence first. The realization that his billionaire persona was permanently dead finally shattered whatever fragile mental barrier he had left. He let out a pathetic guttural whimper. He shifted his weight on the expensive Persian rug. He did not stand up. He did not even try to maintain a shred of personal dignity. Instead, the 35-year-old former golden child dropped completely onto his hands and knees. He began to physically crawl across the floor toward me. His custom-tailored suit dragged pitifully against the wool fibers, gathering dust and lint. He closed the distance and threw his upper body forward. His shaking hands desperately grabbed at the ankles of my designer heels. He buried his tear-soaked face directly against my leather shoes, sobbing with such violent force that his entire back convulsed. It was an agonizing, humiliating display of complete surrender. "Stella." "Please," Connor choked out, his voice muffled against my footwear. "I am begging you. I will do absolutely anything you want. I will sign over every single asset I own. I will give you the cars, the bank accounts, the properties. I will work for you for the rest of my life. I will be your slave. I will scrub your floors. Just please call your agency. Call the federal investigators. Tell the Securities and Exchange Commission that the data was corrupted. Tell them the algorithm made a mistake. Just delete the files, Stella. Please do not let them put me in a federal prison. I will not survive in there." I looked down at the man who had happily let our parents drug me to cover up his felony hit and run. I felt absolutely nothing for him. No pity, no sibling affection, just cold clinical disgust. I carefully took a half step backward, smoothly pulling my shoes out of his frantic grasp. "You truly are delusional until the bitter end, Connor," I stated, my voice echoing sharply above his pathetic weeping. "You cannot simply hit a delete button on a federal grand jury subpoena. The Department of Justice already has the encrypted ledgers. The forensic reports have been verified by 3 independent government agencies. Your entire fraudulent empire is currently sitting on the desk of a federal prosecutor. There is no magical undo button for stealing tens of millions of dollars from senior citizens. You are going to prison, and no amount of groveling at my feet will change that mathematical certainty." Connor let out a hollow wail and collapsed flat onto his stomach, burying his head in his arms, entirely broken. Richard realized that Connor's begging had failed completely. The imposing, aggressive patriarch who had threatened to sue me into oblivion just 20 minutes ago was entirely gone. He took a hesitant, trembling step toward me. His expensive dress shirt was completely soaked with sweat, sticking uncomfortably to his chest and underarms. The color had drained from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified, aged old man. "Stella, listen to me," Richard pleaded, his deep voice cracking into a high, panicked register. "I am sorry. I am so incredibly sorry for everything. I was wrong. I was wrong about the college fund. I was wrong about the doctor. I was wrong about the way we treated you. But you have to listen to reason. I am your father. We share the same DNA. Blood is thicker than water. We are family. You cannot just destroy your own flesh and blood. Please show us some mercy. We can fix this quietly. We can pay the money back." I turned my head and locked my eyes directly onto his sweating, desperate face. I let his hollow apology hang in the frozen air. "Blood is thicker than water," I repeated, slowly dissecting the phrase with surgical precision. "That is a fascinating proverb for you to use right now, Richard. Where exactly was that deep, unbreakable family loyalty when you pinned my arms behind my back in the kitchen? Where was that precious blood connection when you stole my $150,000 education fund to pay off a corrupt police chief? Where was your mercy when you let Helen force heavy sedatives down my throat so you could label me a paranoid schizophrenic?" Richard opened his mouth, but his jaw just trembled uselessly. "You do not care about blood," I continued, my voice striking him like a physical blow. "You care about your country club membership. You care about your luxury cars and your pretentious dinner parties. You are only apologizing right now because you are absolutely terrified of spending your retirement in a concrete cell. You are a coward, Richard. You always have been. Do not ever insult my intelligence by calling yourself my father again." Richard visibly shrank backward, his chest caving in as the reality of his inescapable doom washed over him. He had no threats left to throw. He had no money left to use as a shield. He was completely powerless. I slowly turned my attention to the far corner of the living room. Helen was standing there pressed tightly against the expensive floral wallpaper. The aggressive, shrieking narcissist who had proudly called me the toxic cancer of this family was entirely gone. Her perfectly styled hair was a ruined, tangled mess. Her mascara had run down her cheeks in thick, dark streaks. Her manicured hands were shaking violently at her sides. For the first time in my 33 years of life, Helen could not look me in the eye. She kept her gaze fixed firmly on the baseboards, her chest heaving with silent, terrified sobs. She looked exactly like a cornered rat. The woman who had spent 2 decades calling me a useless piece of trash was now paralyzed with pure, unadulterated fear of the very daughter she had tried to destroy. "You are awfully quiet over there, Helen," I remarked, my tone conversational, but laced with absolute lethal intent. "Just an hour ago, you demanded that I sign over my grandmother's estate. You demanded that I sacrifice my freedom to save your precious reputation. You proudly announced to a room full of people that I was a massive disappointment. But look at you now. You cannot even lift your head. You cannot even string a single sentence together." Helen let out a sharp, pathetic whimper, pressing her back harder against the wall as if hoping it would swallow her whole. "You finally realize it, do you not?" I asked, taking one slow, deliberate step toward her. "You realize that your entire perfect, wealthy suburban life was built on a foundation of massive, unforgivable lies. And you realize that the daughter you treated like absolute garbage is the exact person who holds the match. You are nothing, Helen. You are a fraud, a criminal, and a terrible mother. And the absolute best part is that every single person in your social circle now knows exactly what kind of monster you truly are." The silence that followed my words was absolute perfection. Connor wept into the rug. Richard stared blankly at his own trembling hands. Helen continued to shake uncontrollably in the corner. Bradley was still frozen by the front door, too terrified to even breathe. They had completely run out of lies, out of threats, and out of time. The execution was almost complete. Connor was still clutching desperately at the leather of my shoes. I looked down at his tear-soaked face, feeling absolutely nothing but pure clinical detachment. I lifted my right foot and firmly kicked his hands away. The motion was sharp, disgusted, and entirely final. Connor let out a pathetic gasp, collapsing onto his side like a discarded puppet whose strings had just been violently severed. I stepped entirely out of his reach. The time for begging had expired 10 minutes ago. I turned my back on my brother and walked unhurriedly toward the velvet armchair where I had draped my tailored trench coat. The four of them watched my every single movement with wide, paralyzed eyes. They were completely held hostage by their own paralyzing fear, unable to speak or move. I picked up the heavy beige fabric, slipping my arms into the sleeves with slow, deliberate precision. I adjusted the lapels, smoothing out the invisible wrinkles. I tightened the belt around my waist. Every second I took felt like a physical weight crushing the remaining air out of their lungs. I walked back to the glass coffee table and reached for my crystal wine glass. There was exactly one sip of the rich Cabernet Sauvignon left. I raised the glass to the light, admiring the deep crimson color, and drank it down. The taste of total victory was incredibly sweet. I set the empty crystal gently onto the glass table. It made a soft, highly satisfying clink against the surface. I casually lifted my left wrist, pulling back the cuff of my coat to check the face of my designer watch. The timing was absolutely flawless. I let my hand drop to my side. I looked at the four shattered human beings trapped in the living room with me. Helen was still pressed against the far wall, trembling violently in her ruined cashmere. Richard was staring at the floor, utterly defeated and sweating profusely. Connor was weeping silently on the rug. Bradley was paralyzed near the archway, completely trapped by his own cowardice. I offered them one final brilliant and terrifying smile. I looked straight into their terrified eyes, and delivered the exact sentence I had been waiting 5 years to say. Federal agents are surrounding the house. The 6 words left my lips with the cold, lethal impact of an executioner's blade. They barely had a fraction of a second to comprehend the absolute finality of my statement. Before the echo of my voice could even fade into the heavy silence of the living room, the entire world outside the mansion violently exploded. A blinding strobing flash of intense red and blue tactical lights ripped through the sheer silk curtains, painting the walls of the luxurious living room in the harsh, frantic colors of law enforcement. The deafening, high-pitched wail of multiple police sirens shattered the pristine, quiet tranquility of the wealthy Connecticut suburb. Tires screeched aggressively across the manicured driveway gravel. Heavy boots pounded against the stone steps of the front porch in a rapid, synchronized rhythm. Then an amplified voice boomed through a heavy-duty megaphone, the sheer volume shaking the glass panes in the window frames. FBI, open the door. Total, unadulterated chaos instantly consumed the room. The reality of a federal prison sentence finally broke whatever fragile mental barrier Connor had left. His survival instinct kicked into absolute overdrive. He scrambled off the Persian rug, letting out a wild, animalistic scream of pure panic. He sprinted blindly toward the heavy French doors leading to the rear patio, fully intending to smash through the expensive glass and flee into the backyard. He never even made it past the dining area. The rear doors burst open with explosive force. 3 heavily armored federal agents wearing dark tactical gear stormed into the house, completely obliterating the wooden doorframe. They moved with terrifying speed and precision. The lead agent tackled Connor squarely in the chest mid-flight. The golden child hit the floor with a brutal breath, stealing impact instantly buried under the weight of 3 heavily armed men. His face was slammed directly into the designer rug as cold steel handcuffs forcefully clicked tightly around his wrists. Connor wailed a high, desperate sound as his face was pressed hard against the floorboards. Bradley did not even attempt to run. The slick, arrogant chief financial officer instantly realized that fleeing a federal raid would only guarantee a maximum security sentence and an immediate tackle to the ground. The moment the front door was breached by a battering ram, the heavy oak swinging violently inward on broken hinges, Bradley dropped straight to his knees in the grand foyer. He placed both hands firmly on the back of his head, openly weeping like a terrified child, as 2 tactical agents aggressively secured his arms behind his back and hauled him upward by his expensive suit jacket. Richard, the great imposing patriarch of the Evans family, decided to play his very last pathetic card. He clutched his chest with both hands, letting out a loud, exaggerated groan of agony. He dramatically collapsed onto the hardwood floor, gasping heavily for air, actively demanding an ambulance and a private doctor. He genuinely thought he could fake a massive cardiac event to delay his inevitable arrest. The federal agents did not even pause. They had seen every cheap trick in the white-collar criminal playbook. A towering tactical officer stepped entirely over Richard's flailing legs, grabbed him roughly by the back of his leather belt, and hauled him forcefully to his feet, completely ignoring his terrible amateur acting performance. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud and federal extortion," the agent barked, slamming Richard's hands against the wall and snapping the steel cuffs securely into place. Richard whimpered, all his bravado evaporating the second the cold metal locked around his wrists. Helen completely shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The polished, narcissistic country club matriarch totally lost her mind. 2 female federal agents approached her, their expressions hard and unforgiving. As they grabbed her arms and began reciting her Miranda rights for active conspiracy to commit financial fraud, Helen unleashed a guttural, blood-curdling shriek. She fought against their grip, her perfectly manicured nails scratching uselessly against their tactical vests. She turned her head wildly, searching the chaotic room, until her manic tear-filled eyes locked directly onto me. "Stella." Helen screamed, her voice tearing her throat raw with absolute bottomless despair. "Stella, please. Tell them to stop. We are your family. Please do not let them take me. I stood perfectly still in the center of the hurricane, my hands tucked casually into the pockets of my trench coat. I watched the agents drag my brother, my former fiancé, and my parents toward the flashing lights of the armored vehicles waiting in the driveway. I watched their luxurious fake empire burn completely to the ground. I did not flinch at my mother's desperate screaming. I did not offer a single word of comfort or forgiveness. I just stood in the quiet wreckage of the intervention they had built to destroy me, and I watched them go. 6 months passed. The transition from the explosive siren-filled night in Connecticut to the crisp, serene autumn morning on my New York City penthouse balcony was nothing short of absolute perfection. I stood 80 floors above the bustling streets of Manhattan, holding a sleek stainless steel watering can. I carefully poured a measured stream of water into the soil of a thriving orchid. The air up here was clean, silent, and entirely mine. There were no fake smiles, no manipulative interventions, and absolutely no toxic family members breathing down my neck. The fallout from that Easter Sunday had been spectacular, brutal, and mathematically precise. The federal prosecutors did not even need to break a sweat. They simply took the comprehensive forensic data portfolio I handed them and systematically bulldozed the entire fraudulent empire. Connor was the first to fall completely. The trial was a highly publicized media circus. The golden child of the Evans family stood before a federal judge stripped of his custom-tailored Italian suits and his arrogant Silicon Valley swagger. He wore a standard-issue orange jumpsuit. The prosecution presented the offshore routing numbers, the forged investor statements, and the undeniable proof of his massive Ponzi scheme. He was found guilty on multiple counts of wire fraud, securities fraud, and grand larceny. The judge did not show an ounce of mercy to a man who stole the retirement funds of his own relatives to finance a lifestyle of fake luxury. Connor was sentenced to 20 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. The billionaire prodigy was officially reduced to a federal inmate number, locked in a concrete cell, where his manipulative charm held absolutely zero currency. Bradley did not fare much better. My former fiancé tried to secure a plea deal by offering to testify against my brother, desperately hoping to save his own skin. But the Department of Justice already had all the digital evidence they needed. They did not need a rat, and they certainly did not offer him a golden parachute. Bradley received an 8-year federal prison sentence for his role in the financial conspiracy and for the illegal transfer of stolen funds to offshore Cayman Island accounts. But his true punishment came from his wealthy wife. Rebecca was utterly ruthless. She hired a team of aggressive divorce attorneys who immediately severed all legal ties with him. They froze his remaining assets, liquidated his cars, and completely destroyed his reputation in the financial sector. Bradley walked into a prison cell with absolutely nothing to his name. He was a ruined, penniless fraud permanently exiled from the high society he had sacrificed his soul to join. But the most satisfying poetic justice was reserved entirely for Richard and Helen. The untouchable suburban king and queen were dragged violently off their high horses and thrown directly into the mud. They were formally indicted on multiple federal charges, including conspiracy to commit wire fraud, aiding and abetting a known felon, and active concealment of criminal activities. The Securities and Exchange Commission, along with civil litigators representing the defrauded investors, moved swiftly and mercilessly. The majestic Connecticut mansion, the very house where I had endured 2 decades of psychological abuse, was forcefully seized by the banks. The sprawling property was foreclosed and sold at a public auction. Every single expensive painting, every piece of designer furniture, and every luxury vehicle was liquidated to pay back the millions of dollars Connor had stolen from Aunt Brenda, Uncle Tom, and the rest of the extended family. The country club immediately revoked their memberships. Their affluent neighbors pretended they did not exist. The relatives who had once worshipped the ground Richard walked on now actively testified against him in court, securing their own financial restitution by feeding my parents directly to the wolves. Richard and Helen lost absolutely everything. Their bank accounts were frozen. They were forced to move into a cramped, dilapidated apartment in a low-income housing district, completely stripped of their wealth, their pride, and their falsely curated social standing. They now spent their days hiding from the disgusted stares of the public, drowning in a sea of insurmountable legal debt, facing the terrifying reality of their upcoming criminal trials. They had sacrificed their only innocent daughter to build a kingdom of lies, and now they were buried alive under the crushing weight of its collapse. I set the watering can down on the glass patio table. My smartphone vibrated softly in the pocket of my silk robe. I pulled the device out and glanced at the bright screen. It was a secure text message from my corporate attorney. The presiding judge just issued the final ruling on the bail modification request. Richard and Helen's petition for reduced bond has been officially denied. They remain in state custody pending trial. Flight risk deemed too high. I read the text message twice, absorbing the absolute finality of the judge's decision. There would be no magical bailouts. There would be no last-minute legal loopholes. My parents were going to sit in a cold concrete holding cell, entirely cut off from the luxurious world they believed they were entitled to rule. I did not reply to the attorney. I simply locked the screen of my phone, the display turning pitch black, and slipped the device back into my pocket. I leaned my hands against the cool metal railing of my balcony and looked out over the magnificent sprawling skyline of New York City. The morning sun reflected brilliantly off the towering glass skyscrapers, warming my face with the promise of a brilliant, completely unburdened future. They always said I was the failure of the family. They repeated it for years, etching the word into my mind, until they believed it was an absolute truth. I looked out at the empire I had built from absolutely nothing. I thought about the multi-million-dollar firm I commanded the criminals I had brought to justice, and the profound, unbreakable peace I finally possessed. They were right. I failed. I failed at being their obedient victim. I failed at staying silent. I failed at letting them destroy my mind to protect their twisted, fragile egos. And that is the greatest failure of my life. The most profound lesson we can extract from this journey is that blood relation does not automatically guarantee love, respect, or loyalty. Society often conditions us to believe that family is an unbreakable bond, demanding our endless sacrifice and silent endurance, regardless of how severely we are mistreated. However, as this story powerfully illustrates, tolerating deep psychological abuse simply because it comes from your parents or siblings is not a virtue. It is a slow, agonizing destruction of your own soul. We are constantly taught to be the bigger person, to forgive the unforgivable, and to keep the peace entirely at the expense of our own mental health. But true lasting peace only arrives when we find the absolute courage to draw a firm line and recognize that toxic behavior is unacceptable, even when it is carefully disguised as parental concern or family duty. Furthermore, this narrative completely redefines the very concept of failure. When the people who are supposed to nurture your growth actively try to tear you down, failing to meet their twisted, narcissistic expectations is actually your greatest personal victory. Walking away from a deeply manipulative environment requires an immense amount of inner strength. It means stepping into the terrifying unknown and taking full responsibility for your own future. Building your own empire from the ashes of their rejection proves that your inherent worth is never dictated by the conditional approval of others. It is forged exclusively by your resilience, your relentless hard work, and your unwavering commitment to the truth. You have the absolute right to protect your peace, to reclaim your personal narrative, and to walk away from any table where respect is no longer being served. If you found value in this lesson on claiming your independence and setting unbreakable boundaries, please hit the like button and subscribe to join a community of survivors who refuse to be silenced.